Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Wilderness of Mirrors show, which is a subsection of my Politically Homeless podcast. And with me is my co host, Alex Benish from Germany. And I'd like to welcome you to our third installment of the show. We're going to be talking about my recent piece on the Red Dawn 2.0, the ultimate domino, on my Substack newsletter. We're also going to be talking about the Republican convention that occurred recently. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive again into Trump, into his vice presidential nominee, Senator J.D. Vance, and probably a potpourri of other topics as well. Welcome back, Alex. How you doing today?
I'm doing fine, doing fine. Hope you're doing fine as well. I have compiled a lot of notes, not just on your paper on the current situation, but I also wrote a piece on an earlier implementation of the same program, right? Because when you talk about Red Dawn scenarios, or you refer to the movies that have been done about this, sometimes people think, well, this is just a theoretical danger, right? I mean, who could ever imagine a Red Dawn in America? This sounds like a Hollywood movie and whatnot. But this thing almost happened in Germany, right here in 1923. And we're not talking about some banana republic here. This was Germany. And so that almost happened. All the pieces were in play. This was a multi-pronged strategy, just like they would do it today. They had the propagandists, they had the underground fighters ready, they had the infiltrators everywhere, they had terrorist groups ready, Soviet advisors ready, Soviet generals ready. They were ready to ship in stuff, get the ball rolling, and then the Red Army would join these communists here and close the deal and seal the fate of all Germans. They actually wanted to make Germany the center of the world revolution. That's what they called it. They want to wave the flag over Berlin and say, this is our gateway into the West. And guess who would have been the next target? France, Britain, and the United States, for the most part. And once they would have taken over Germany, they would have gotten all the industry, all the technology, all the universities, and the personnel, the engineers and the people who worked in all these specialized factories. So by taking over us, that makes Russia more dangerous. And this was the case back then. It certainly is the case now. So I've compiled some of the notes. So we're going to quickly go through this old implementation of the program, and then we get into the current implementation of the very same program.
No, that sounds good. I mean, Lenin actually had stated early in the Bolshevik revolutionary days in Russia, in their years in power, that whoever has Germany has all of Europe.
Exactly. And now, of course, the Weimar era of Germany was the most liberal era, I think, in German history. So this is right after World War One. There was a shaky democracy, all kinds of radicals running around, and you had these competing ideologies, not just people that said we want a republic, a democratic republic. Then you had the guys that said, no, we really want to go back to aristocracy. Then you had the radical communists. Then you had the softer version of the communists who sometimes didn't even like Moscow that much. And then you had the fascists, the Nazis, who were also into traditional conspiracy ideology. So everybody was trying to get ahead and recruit people and change the system the way they wanted to. But these Russian guys, they were strangely professional about all of this. And so this was 1923. The plan was for a full-blown communist revolution, Red Army invading to total takeover. And so when you look at all these different aspects that were in place, right? So the communists, they had a cell system, right? They were creating these espionage cells, sometimes as little as 3 people per cell. So if you lose one cell, the damage is not that great. And by using the cell system, they could then create different groups. One was the warriors, the fighters. The other one was terrorists. Then you had the infiltrators who would join the army, the Reichswehr, the police, and everything. All these different groups, and one group obviously was the propaganda. And so you had this guy. His name was Willy Münzenberg. They called him the Red Millionaire, and he was running all kinds of communist papers in the 20s, books and theater and even cinema. They would get these terrible movies from the Soviet Union, and then they would, make a German version out of it, and it became quite successful because that's all there was in cinema back then. There wasn't much choice back then. People didn't expect that much, in terms of entertainment. So this was kind of like a situation that is compared to different countries nowadays. People talk about a Weimar type situation. It's very liberal, but there's all kinds of freaky ideologies around. It's very unstable, and everybody tries to use freedom of the press and freedom of speech to hide behind and plan some sort of revolution. And so, so this is, so then in September of 1923, President Ebert he initiated a state of emergency because they knew what the communists were about to do. So he gave the executive power went over to the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gessler, and General Segt, so they could do all kinds of things and try to shut down the communists, because the communists were ready to roll. They told everybody it's on. We're gonna start now because we spent years preparing this. There was the Soviet official Grigory Zinoviev. He was wiring his instructions from the Kremlin to Berlin on October 1st, and they said in a matter of weeks, the big event is going to happen. So everybody was getting ready. In the Soviet Union, they were all talking about this in the military schools. They said it's going to happen. We will get involved. And on October 10th, the Red Banner newspaper, the communist paper in Germany, they published a text by Stalin himself announcing it's going to happen very soon. So the Soviets were getting the money. They were getting the money in. They were getting the grain ready to feed their revolution. Thousands of Soviet officials were ready to take over control over Germany. And the Soviet general Peter Skoblevsky had actually traveled to Germany because everything was about to happen. He was running an underground army of communist fighters. But then what happened is the German government, they implemented some kind of martial law state. And so they were moving troops into parts of Germany. They surrounded the city of Dresden and they deposed the government there. So this is the point where the revolution was canceled for the moment. And this was shocking to everybody, all the communists in Germany, because they thought everything was going to happen right then and there. So very frustrating for these people like Willy Münzenberg. He was a rich guy and he showed his wealth. And he thought, well, it's just postponed, right? It's going to happen in a few years. We're just going to publish the newspapers, get ready, make more preparation. It's going to happen. But what happened was the Nazis became powerful throughout the 20s, and nothing was really moving ahead with the communists. So at some point, and this is what historians have figured out since then, at some point the Kremlin had a different strategy. The Russians thought, wouldn't, or the Russian leadership thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a big fat war in Western Europe? You know, the Germans fighting the French, fighting the British. Let them have it. Let them, just weaken each other, and then the Red Army would move in. And also, the order was handed down to the German communists: do not stop the Nazis. Do not stop them. So the intention was that there's supposed to be a Nazi government, there's supposed to be war, and the Red Army would win later. But this new plan was not something that was told to Mr. Willy Münzenberg. And when he started to figure out what was going on, his old Bolshevik friends were already killed in the Soviet Union because they were not on board as well. So he figured out, I got myself into the worst possible mess. Mr. Münzenberg escaped from Germany, and not only were the fascists after him, but the communist intelligence services as well. And at some point, Mr. Münzenberg publicly denounced Stalin, called him a traitor of the revolution, and then Mr. Münzenberg's dead body was found in a little forest somewhere in France, hanged. So this is kind of a short version of the program, right? This takes years to prepare, sometimes decades to prepare. They want to get to a point where they can just launch the final phase, take over, and then establish the new system, and then clean out a bunch of guys that they don't want, people that worked for them, but they don't need them any longer. So they can just kill those guys off, and then grow the next generation of officials, the next generation of young guys who know nothing else. So this is how you solve any future problem once you have that new system in. So this is in a nutshell what happened back then. This is kind of the same stuff that we see in the United States. Now, of course, the authorities or the government in the US is not stupid, right? Because insurgency is a science, but also counterinsurgency is a science. And the Americans, they have sort of perfected that science, I guess. I would not underestimate the American authorities, because even decades ago, they had something like Project Camelot, where they would send out psychologists and anthropologists, and they had computers and algorithms. They were trying to predict uprisings, and nowadays they can do that much better, because they always wanted to be aware of where a big threat is going to happen, so they can intervene early. Now, this is the same thing the Romans tried thousands of years ago, because they had limited security forces. They just had espionage. They just looked around, is some uprising planned somewhere? How many soldiers can we send early to squash the uprising, because we need more soldiers for other areas to conquer? And so, this is kind of this intricate relationship between insurgencies and counterinsurgencies.
Yeah, no, this is a great introduction. What's your recollection and retelling of the history in Germany during the 1920s and into the early 1930s before the National Socialist takeover is very interesting. It shows how the communists and the Soviets and the KPD in Germany, which was what the Communist Party was known as then, that they were very opportunistic. That, as I pointed out in several of my Substack papers and articles, that communism, at least in this country and also in Germany, they've used a two-pronged pincer approach. They're going to use the forces of left-wing ideology in order as a pincer in the attack against a target country, but they're also going to be used as the forces that are collectively associated with the right, whether it's capitalism or whether it's fascism or national socialism, which are both anti-capitalist ideologies and governments and economic structures. They're going to use all these pincers of attack to basically rot the system within. It's basically, you can compare it to the termites attacking the wood in a house. And they're slowly eating away at the structure itself as well as also the foundation. Of course, the foundations and homes are usually concrete, but nevertheless, that's what's the nature of Soviet subversion. It also was the nature of subversion undertaken by the National Socialists during of target countries in Europe and in the United States. They also had a very similar strategy as the Soviets did too, as well, and the Russians and Chinese today. Um, to add to historical sources, there's a really good study. It's a PhD thesis. And if you really want to know the collaboration between the Nazis and the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD and the NSDAP, check out, if you're able to, the thesis by William Daycock Davis called The KPD and the NSDAP, a study of the relationship between political extremes in Weimar Germany from 1923 to 1933. You mentioned, by the way, that date, 1923, because that was the last period of time, as Alex, you had pointed, of the attempted communist revolutions that occurred, particularly in, not only I believe in Bavaria, they were in Saxony, and I
Yeah.
believe in Berlin. And again, about 1923, that's when you had the Soviets also making an effort to approach the Führer and the various associated groups. Well, and there was also, I don't mean to digress, but there was also a pro-Soviet wing of the Nazi Party, which never was really extinguished, by the way, in the 1934 purge. It never was extinguished. A number of Gauleiters in Nazi Germany were Soviet, people like Erich Koch and Wilhelm Kube and Hans Lose, and notably Joseph Goebbels and others. They were very pro-Soviet. Even Hitler had a very contradictory opinion on the Soviet Union. And there were Nazis that joined the GDR as much as they joined Arab countries, the BRD or West German government, and everything else for varying reasons, for subverting it from within, amongst other things. You had one particular, I guess you could say, interesting fellow or loathsome character, Johann von Leers. He was very pro-Soviet during the Nazi era and the post-World War II era. So you had a lot of these people, and they were ripe to be targeted by the Soviets, because you had all these anti-Western currents in German politics. They were very upset about the unfair strictures of the Treaty of Versailles, and it was an unfair treaty. I would agree with that, and the war guilt clause and everything. So it really upset the gambit of German opinion. So you had the Soviets in one pincer of attack against German society. You had the industrialists who wanted to open up profitable markets in Soviet Russia and who were nationalists. So you had that pincer of attack. You had the Social Democrats, Friedrich Ebert and others within the Reichswehr, that wanted to develop secret military relations with the Soviet Russia, which they did. And they had that entry of influence where you had a society that was very hurt by the Treaty of Versailles, and that was directed against the Allied powers. Then you had the KPD, which the Soviets always backed through a variety of means, including money and training. So you had that because you had the class struggle going on in Germany, class polarization, particularly during varying economic downturns for parts of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, minus the prosperity, of course, that Germany did have towards the beginning of the late 1920s. And then you had the Nazi Party, which represented a sort of third position or third way between capitalism and outright Marxism-Leninism. They wanted to create this new version of socialism, but there were a portion of the Nazi Party that viewed the Soviet Union as a potential partner against the Western Allies and Jewish capitalism. So the Soviets, like what I describe in my paper, they have these different pincers, and the purpose of each pincer is to basically break in, take advantage, probe all the pressure points, and move in for the kill. And they had multiple pincers. And that's how it kind of relates to my paper. Here in the United States, we have similar pincers of attack. You have capitalism, you have left wing democracy, excuse me, you have left wing ideology and the alienation and the discontent within elements of the American community. You have the greed of elements of the capitalist class that just want to do business and nothing else. You have a number of different sources, corrupt politicians who are easily blackmailable and everything else. Why? Because Russians and Chinese and their allies today, they want to rot American society at the seams. And just like what the Soviets wanted to do during 1920s and early 1930s Germany. And really what you talk about, my biggest takeaway, and I'll close out with this, is the Soviets, like the Nazis, were incredibly opportunistic. They are willing to make deals with their enemies,
Mm-hmm.
like the Harzburg Front of the Nazi Party, where the Nazis admitted, even at times openly, that we're just using the short sighted bourgeois bloc, as Joseph Goebbels stated in a 1930 article in the Nationalsozialistische Monatschaften, which is one of their publications, I think, for theoretical works. And he basically said, look, we're just taking advantage of the short sighted bourgeois bloc in order to get money, in order to have a united front against the Weimar Republic. And I would argue the Nazis were, in the early days up until the late 1930s, they really were pretty effective at political warfare, particularly against the West, and taking advantage of both the radical quisling fascist groups as well as industrialists and elitists and their own short-sighted greed and stupidity against themselves. The communists are, on the other hand, they are just as psychopathic as the National Socialist or elements of the National Socialist leadership, with one exception. The communists are better at assessing calculated risk. They're not just going to have a moment of irrationalism and just start firing off the missiles. They're waiting for the correlation of forces to be permanently in their favor, and they take what is termed calculated risk. Are we going to basically pull this off without the United States, in this case, resisting? And that's my view of communists, where the Nazis, they had an element of calculated risk, but what they did was is that they assumed that the United States was on its last legs, essentially, because of the Depression. And they figured they could make the move because of Western appeasement and everything else. And they had that resources of the Soviet Union during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Germans Soviet non-aggression pact, to feed them the resources to defeat the Low Countries and France and then possibly Britain and everything. But they underestimated that. The Chinese and the Russians, I would argue, they've learned from these mistakes, and they're psychopaths, just like the National Socialists, but they are much more into taking calculated risks. They're dotting every I and crossing every T, making sure everything is prepared to the hilt. Because the East Germans and the rest of the Warsaw Pact did that during the Cold War. They had everything meticulously planned, to even street signs
Mm.
that they were going to rename the streets in West Germany in the event of an invasion and occupation. They had occupation marks, occupation currency printed. They had renamed street signs. They were going to, supposedly, I think, from what I remember, they had plans to install DKP and elements of the SPD as puppet governments in West Germany. They had names of over 150,000 people to be killed in the event of a successful occupation. They had Blucher medals. I know you read about it because it was publicized in Germany after 1990. They even had medals, even minted and crafted for East German soldiers and officers on the upon a victory over the West Germans and the NATO forces, they had what were called Blucher medals, named after the famous German general von Blucher. They had those medals minted. They had everything prepared to a T, and they wait for the moment. From my study and research and common strategic sense, they're waiting until the United States is basically, you have the combination of an anti-interventionist mood in the United States, a demoralized American public, combined with the fact that we've outsourced quite a bit of our industry. And despite some of the ham-handed efforts of Trump and Biden, this is reindustrializing the United States. The American elite is not on the same page on that. We're very divided on that. The Republican Party, there are some good voices to reindustrialize the United States, which is critical to resisting a Red Dawn scenario. You can't even have a conversation about preventing a Red Dawn scenario without reconfiguring our economy away from extreme forms of financialization and back towards the bread and butter production, which won the United States and the world World War II. Because if the United States, and I'll close on this, I apologize for going on and on. It's something I'm very passionate about. If we were an economy that was solely based on Walmart and Wall Street,
Oh yeah.
the United States, we would have been screwed. The United States would have been occupied by the Germans and the Japanese, and there would have been hell to pay, as Albert Speer had recalled in an interview in 1971 on what the Nazi plan for their global superstate was to be. Said it would have been a living hell, basically. So it's industry, it's factories, it's workers, it's patriotic capitalists that had saved the United States and saved the world. And nothing is more disheartening than the people like Grover Norquist of Americans for Tax Reform, and a part of these Tea Party libertarian groups, the Cato Institute, the Club for Growth, a lot of the corporate conservatives that are still left in the Heritage Foundation, a number of people that work close to the Trump administration, like Stephen Moore and Art Laffer and others. If their economic ideas prevailed, we would have the Red Dawn scenario in a heartbeat in this country by Russia and China, or Nazi, a National Socialist takeover and slavery as well. And that's why I'm so critical of those elements of the right. They are killing the country, and it's a pincer of attack. Many of them are free traders that are for economic intercourse with Russia and China. And then the left-wing ideologies, particularly the tanky elements, the hardcore Marxist Leninists and Democratic Socialists of America, they want to rot the country through class struggle and the confiscation of private property and things of that nature. So I'll stop now.
Well,
So thank you for.
you talk about in the paper about specific vulnerabilities of the United States, such as the highway system, such as the supermarkets that everybody depends on. So, I mean, for a long time, the sheer size of the United States was always an advantage, but it also has certain disadvantages, because if goods have to be transported over a very long distance, that becomes a supply line, and supply lines, if they're long, they're vulnerable. And so there's many ways you can figure out the weaknesses of America, and you can start attacking these different spots. And also, you mentioned a variety of tools in that Russian/Chinese toolbox. So there could be a smallpox outbreak on one coast of the United States, and nobody will ever figure out who did it, because every moron in this world has smallpox, and it can be deployed very silently. So there may be even some false leads that confuse the authorities on who was behind it. So that's one thing. Then of course you have the options of destroying the food supply in America by using specific types of pathogens, right? So it looks like it has developed organically. So they call it the new bird flu, the new swine flu, the new cow disease, everything, so you can destroy the food supply. Then there's separate secession movements, separatist movements, when some radicals in Texas say we want to have a Republic of Texas, and then some leftist guys say, well, if they have a Republic of Texas, we're gonna have ourselves a commie Republic of California. And so you start to see things breaking apart, and then some you could have a mass movement like let's say a truther conspiracy type movement, and they take control, maybe with Russian help or Chinese help. They take control over a certain area, and then they say to the federal government, we are our own state now, and you don't want to have a civil war, do you? Because that would be highly unpopular. Are we not civilized, right? They will argue you cannot force people into this union who don't want to be part of that union. So there's so many ways to start hacking away at America and breaking off pieces and using this ideology, because people are so close-minded. Everything is like a religion nowadays, right? It's like there's this radical libertarians, and there's this people, conservatives or whatever, they act like aristocrats, and then there's people that say we need fascism, and there's people, all kinds of people, and they're so close-minded. And I always tell that to activists. One activist may say, I'm the biggest Catholic in the world. The next activist will say, no, the Catholics are behind the grand world conspiracy. But each and every individual group in America is too small to force its will onto everybody else, right? So it's like a pointless game of creating these mini kingdoms, or these ideological cults and mini kingdoms, which is something that that's also strategy that the Russians are trying to use here. We recently had a very unusual thing happening. There was a media company that was completely banned. The police came, took everything, all the bank accounts, all the equipment. It's now forbidden. And that media organization, they were using right-wing extremist content. They were using conspiracy content. They tried to stay legal somewhat, but the underlying current was deemed to be illegal, which is actually a thing in German law, right? You cannot have an insurgency. They don't call it that. They call it something else, but it's basically a counterinsurgency law that is built into the German constitution. You cannot conspire against the republic. And so now there's a lawsuit, of course, because that's possible, against banning this media platform. And when this goes to court, we will actually get to see how much material German intelligence has collected about this media platform. And guess what? This media platform in Germany is connected, or was connected, to all these people that you mention in your paper. Alexander Dugin, the Russian crazy professor, the guy with the big beard who wants to create chaos in America, who even wrote about wanting to cause chaos in America. And there's all these links to Russian oligarchs that have paintings of Russian czars in their office, and they're tied to Ukraine. And there's been emails that have been hacked of people facilitating meetings between key players. And so the name of that German media company came up multiple times. So this is what we're talking about. It's a serious insurgency problem. And I can sort of guess the counterinsurgency capabilities of the United States. And of course, that carries within itself the risk of martial law, or during a war between NATO and the Eastern Bloc. Usually what we see in those situations, it's very authoritarian. The government can do almost anything because of emergency laws. So would these emergency laws then end? Now, we've seen that before in World War I, especially, I believe. There was some pretty crazy legislation in the United States against subversive propaganda. So they knew these people were gonna be crawling out of the woodwork and say, don't join the military, don't join the war, let everything unfold. And so this was kind of a moment when there was a crackdown on speech in America as a counterinsurgency policy. And then when the war was over, these restrictions were then lifted. But as you and I have talked about in the previous show on the Republican Party and Project 2025, there's a strong aristocratic current in the Republican Party. Once they get a specific level of power, would they relinquish that ever again? Right? This is kind of an interesting question. So I'm not a silly activist. I know how important counterinsurgency is, but we still have to do it right. So we cannot just throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to say.
Yeah, no, and there's not only has to be a counterinsurgency effort possibly in the future, unfortunately, but there also has to be an appreciation for strategic thinking amongst our policymakers, and many within our policymaking and elite in the Senate and the House, and the presidency have been very short-sighted, notably. I don't know if that's an American thing or just a human frailty or issue, but that's one issue. The other part is there has to be an appreciation for true counterintelligence too, as well, and deception operations. Now, you mentioned the Republican Party. There are some figures here and there that get the picture. People like Trevor Loudon, who is plugged into the Republican Party in various conservative circles. He's a widely known speaker, as both of us know, and many in the audience know. He's been on my program before. I know, Alex, you've been on various anti-communist conference roundtables with him. So you do have those folks who really have an understanding of the picture. Um, but you mentioned the Project 2025 people, and I know this show, obviously, our topic is not that. But my concern is, and this is the Achilles heel, and I talk about it all the time, probably ad nauseum, but my concern is with that document, one of multiple concerns I have is, and there are things I support in Project 2025 when reading through it, to be clear, but many things I also oppose. But there's a lot that they leave out. The fact that they allow, and I'm all for free debate, I don't like the idea of jailing or censoring my opponents unless they are committing a crime or they need to be watched because they have ties with hostile foreign powers. So I get that. But to me, when we're in a situation where China and Russia is rising, and you include people like libertarian free traders who are against any measures to protect and regrow American industry and really take a tough economic stand against communist China, those people should not be allowed to sit at the table of discussions. They have been wrong over and over again. They were the same ones that counseled economic appeasement and defense withdrawals and defense cutbacks during the Cold War. Or they might be okay with a strong national defense, but they have no problem exporting technologies during the Cold War to the Soviet Union simultaneously. I'm talking about people like Dr. Milton Friedman and George Gilder and others who are very popular and sought after during the Reagan administration, for example. So, my concern is if you're including in your camp, in the MAGA camp, libertarian free traders and wealthy donors who profit from trade with China, like you guys were talking about the TikTok issue, Jean Rabin, to
Yeah.
his credit, bringing it up. Well, why did Trump reverse himself on that? Well, it was widely believed that after a visit with libertarian billionaire, excuse me, Jeffrey Yass from Pennsylvania, who I believe is a major hedge fund player, if you will, or hedge fund executive, and he is an investor in TikTok, which of course has a tremendous amount of Chinese power and influence in it and investment behind it. He's like, no, no, no. My economic interests are going to be impaired.
Hmm.
So he's looking after what he perceives solely as his economic self-interest and those of his associates, and putting that over the long-term survival of capitalism. Because we know in a world where China and Russia is victorious, capitalism will be extinguished and exterminated, essentially. But they don't think of that. So when you're including these forces that are hardcore free traders, globalist types, and members of the corporate cartel that are for these business ties, when you include them in the discussion, you're subverting your own project of building defense. And I would propose, and I talk about this in my Substack essay, on what is radical civic nationalism, which is my ideological, personal political ideology, as I termed it. You can have short term coalitions with libertarians and many even corporate Republicans. There are things where people like myself will agree with them on certain narrow issues. But permanent coalitions, if you want to start, and Project 2025 really is kind of how to build, is not only a policy making document, but also behind that a sort of coalition type of document. You can't include Jeffrey Yass in the coalition. You can't include Stephen Moore and Art Laffer. They need to be thrown overboard when it comes to permanent coalition building. Just like if you're pursuing social reform in the United States and a better form of capitalism, you're not going to include Democratic Socialists of America. Sure, they're for strong unions, but what is their purpose? What is their reasoning? Does the DSA really want just let's tinker around the edges and
Yeah.
make the system better? No, they will have placards in the street that say defund the police, no borders, no police, and well, no, abolish the police, abolish profit, and abolish borders. So again, that's very indicative of the long-term purposes, just like the Jeffrey Yasses and all these other people. You have to look at the agenda of each of the players. You have to look at the intentions, the long-term goals, and that's how you can really judge on whether you can make permanent political coalitions with and whatnot. And that is so important. So I'm glad you brought that up. I see that as vulnerabilities in the Republican camp. Now, in the Democratic camp, one of the biggest problems is that you have the progressive wing, which carries the bacillus of this old idea of McGovernism and the New Left. And the Democratic Party, the Communist Party USA, always had that presence for several decades. It's called the All People's Front, starting in the 1980s. And the reasoning is that let's use, as the former chairman of the Communist Party USA, Gus Hall, termed it in his book, A Lame Duck in Turbulent Waters, that one of the operating legs of the Communist Party USA was the, quote, liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And they used that, and the Russians used that as a pressure point to advance their interests, just like Mr. Putin stated in 2020, shortly before Biden was elected president, that even though he doesn't like the Democratic Party's anti Russia rhetoric and anti Putin rhetoric, but we can work with Mr. Biden because he wants to resurrect the INF treaty and have a new START treaty to supposedly limit nuclear arsenal, which we know the Russians always violate. They never keep their end of the bargains in any of these nuclear disarmament treaties. And the other part, again, Pincer point coming from the left, is that Mr. Putin said we can also work with the left wing of the Democratic Party
Yeah.
because we have a lot in common. Mr. Putin said, I like socialist and communist ideas, and that the U.S. Democratic Party does have that social democratic wing that we can work with. Even the type of social democracy that they can work with, not the other type of social democracy, which the Russians and the rest of the communist apparatus absolutely hate because they just want to reform capitalism and tinker it around and make it more socially
Yeah.
conscious, which is somewhat more akin to my viewpoint. They view that kind of reform as absolutely horrible and the worst thing in the world, but they can work with the socialist wing and the socialist types in the Democratic Party. That's what Mr. Putin says. So again, it's these pincers. And that sets the preparatory stage for Red Dawn in the United States, like in Germany. In Germany, you have different agents, if you will, too. You have Die Linke, which a portion of it is ardently pro-Russian. You have elements of the CDU, CSU that are very much oriented towards business ties with the Russians. And then the Social Democrats. I mean, for God's sakes, for goodness sakes, you have what was it? Schroeder, former Chancellor
Yeah.
Gerhard Schroeder, who it basically they all work for like Gazprom and all these other Russian companies and everything, with, by the way, ex-Stasi and East German gas and oil industry
Oh
executives
yeah.
who now work all of a sudden for Gazprom. And then on top of that, you have the AFD, which even portions of their parliamentarians even and representatives will say that they're for China's Belt and Road Initiative, let alone one for high-level AFD politician said, well, it's better that we have Russian gas coming into Germany than Russian tanks going into Germany or German tanks going into Russia or something or another. So a lot of this is also playing out in Germany too. And even during the 1990s, you had high level Russian military documents like the so called Surokoyev document, published in 1995, which talks about how Germany still remains an enemy of Russia and is spearheading the effort to expand NATO. So when you look at the picture, really, would you say, Alex, that really Russia today really has this pincer attack, not only in the United States using the left and the right, capitalism as well as communism to attack a country, they're doing the same thing in Germany, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think one of the major tool that is tied into that strategy is craziness. Because once a person has reached that state of craziness, of cult-like thinking, you cannot reach that person anymore, at least not for a while, with logic and facts and arguments. And now this has been studied, of course, by the Russians and others as well, how you get somebody to that point. And so by using craziness, this is kind of the dirtiest recruitment tactic in all kinds of political camps. So, for example, they tell people don't just be an American conservative patriot. You got to be a crazy ass MAGA, nutbag. Okay, and then they tell the left, don't just be a social democrat. You got to be an outright total communist. And then they tell the libertarians, well, it's not good enough to be just a libertarian. You got to be a hardcore, what they call an anarcho-capitalist. You got to be the most hardcore libertarian guy. You take that libertarianism and you make it even simpler. You make this whole bag of ideas even smaller, so it looks like it's the perfect answer to everything. And then they just play that game, and by turning people crazy. And also, this has been studied as well by marketing professionals. Like, you can find that in the book by, what is it called, Robert Cialdini. His big marketing book is a classic. You get people to publicly commit to the craziness, right? So people can post stuff on the web, on social media, or they put signs in their yard, or they put stickers on their car, or they have a certain way they dress. It's a pro-Trump crazy nutbag T-shirt, or it's like the woke uniform, right? When they get the nose piercing, they get the specific nose piercing, and they get a clownish type of dress. So they say it's not good enough to be just gay or something. No, you gotta be a certain exaggerated ideological being, right? So don't just be gay. You gotta be a crazy person, and then. What happens next? If I'm a company, right, and I need to hire people, who am I going to hire, right? So if people apply for a job in my company and I look at this one person and I see, okay, it's the clown uniform, it's the nose ring, it's pronouns, and you can pretty much tell from that person's social media profile that person is nuts, or the ideas are nuts. It's so exaggerated. You can guess you will have a lot of problems with that person. And the same thing if some sort of a German right-wing extremist or let's say a super crazy MAGA type applies for the job, right? And you can tell on social media that person is online after 3 beers talking the most radical ideas, the most crazy stuff imaginable. it's worse than what he puts on his official social media. Would you hire that person if you think, okay, this guy will probably try to recruit others in my company for crazy ideas, or that person might be involved in criminal activity, or that person may create a lot of friction if the company doesn't go in a certain direction, right? So
Yeah.
it becomes an isolating factor. If you become a crazy and you signal to the world that you're a crazy, you will get negative feedback from the world. And what happens next? That person will more and more withdraw fully into the cult, just severing ties with anybody outside of that cult, because then they feel at home. They feel like they're in a brotherhood, and these people in the cult understand them. Now, that has been studied to death in the 60s and 70s when these new cult movements happened. And the communists were experimenting with mind control stuff, and the Americans too, to a degree. So this is how cults do it. They force you to dress in a specific way. Especially they want you to dress in a ridiculous way so you get negative feedback from the outside world. And also, if you start to do illegal things, maybe even small things, or maybe things that are in the gray area, you will fall down the hill, as they say. They will roll you down the hill. They will get you in trouble, and then you get more negative feedback, and then you withdraw fully into the cult. Now, it's more severe in Germany, I guess, because of Germany's history, obviously, and the laws in Germany. If you say certain ideas, even anonymously, and people find out that it was you, your public life is over. If you pledge allegiance to Nazi ideology, if you believe all the truther stuff, and you just think that the empires have always been run by this Jewish secret lodge and everything, if they catch you, your life is over. So that also means that your group, your cult, can control you because they know your secrets. So they can start pushing you to do things, to go even further. And there's another element to this. You talk about certain people, and I have these quotes here in your paper. You talk about Haz al-Din, Nick Fuentes, and these weirdos, and a lot of them are very successful on social media, right? They have millions of followers in some cases. Now, how does that happen? Because I mentioned the historical case of Willy Münzenberg. Why was he so successful? Because he was a genius in marketing. Well, he got all this money from the Soviets, and he was playing to a crowd, telling them what they were already expecting to hear. And so if anybody out there is an activist, there's very tough competition, right? Because there's so many other activists, and they want to have the most eyeballs on their platforms. So how do you compete? Now, sometimes people, activists, influencers, they will say radical things. They will tell what the audience wants to hear for the money and the fame. So with every influencer, you look at them and you can speculate, are they doing this for the money and the fame? Do they have other motivations? And with some activists and influencers out there, you have to wonder if they're taking Russian money, because even when you're part of the gang, even when you're part of a foreign operation, there's still competition. Just like with Willy Münzenberg, at some point, higher-ranking communists, they started to hate Mr. Münzenberg. He started to hate them. Everybody wanted the top spots in the movement, and they were fighting dirty. To get the top spot. They were denouncing each other as traitors, and they wanted to get the other guy out of the Communist Party. So this is kind of this very dangerous game that is being played, making people crazy, demanding these commitments. And I think that some of these influencers, they may even have to do some of these provocations to prove their loyalty to the cause. Because if they have backers, if they have networks helping them, these networks want to make sure that this guy is for real. So they may order some of these guys out there, well, you got to say something really tough and crazy about this, that, or the other. Otherwise, your career prospects are not that good.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a lot of good points here. There's a few of them I want to take. I wanted to just for the sake of accuracy, give some of the quotes regarding the German scene with the various Russian pincers of attack to give the audience out there an idea of the depth of these quotes and information here before I talk about, as you put it, the sort of the crazies and you talk about the conspiracy theories and whatnot. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this, Alex. Stefan Moeller, an AfD member of the Landtag in the province of
Mm,
Thuringia, stated that, quote, gas from the east is better than tanks being sent to the east. And they talked about another AfD member of parliament or Bundestag published a press release titled Cooperation in China in Mutual Interest Instead of the Cold War, which another AFP member of the Bundestag described China's Belt and Road Initiative as a great opportunity for Germany's geopolitical stability and economic growth. The AfD program for the German federal elections of 2021 supported Germany's active participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this, of course, you can get in my Substack essay, Russian Aggression Towards Ukraine. And I talk about this at great length. It gives you the idea of the pincers of attack because you have similar voices here in the United States saying many of the same things in some way or another. People like Tucker Carlson, for example, to take one notable individual. In some ways, and in other ways, other politicians. Now, you talk about the crazies. I think you're absolutely right. You have people like Haz al-Din who have tremendous social following. Nick Fuentes, who is as just a weird character unto himself, has massive, massive following. And if you look at the paper that I wrote, The Ultimate Domino, which is on my Substack page, it's a lengthy paper. I reproduce these quotes where Mr. America First, Nick Fuentes, is saying that basically Russia and China should dominate the world and the United States, and that the United States should be humiliated. You have Haz al-Din calling for basically revolutionary defeatism, which is a term that the old Bolsheviks use, which is basically the strategy of subversion to when a country, your home country, rightfully or wrongfully, is in a wartime situation, you're calling for a defeat on the home front, essentially. So if, God forbid, we were in a war with China, Mr. Haas was basically saying, Haz al-Din was saying, well, I'm for revolutionary defeatism and the defeat of our ruling class in a war with China. I mean, and Haz al-Din is one of the main conveyors and activist leaders for something called MAGA communism, with this fusion of right-wing MAGA principles with that of Marxism-Leninism. And it's a hook used to ensnare a lot of conservatives and right-wing national populists and things of that nature, people of that nature who are rightfully concerned about, the problems associated with globalism and trade agreements, the free trade agreements, and all the rest of it. Um, so yeah, you have these crazies, you have these, conspiracy theories. It does take hold with many people. And in Germany, from what I've read from my research, one of the purveyors of conspiracy theories is RT Deutsch or RTDE, as I'm
until
sure
they
you've
were
studied
banned.
it. Yeah, they were spreading conspiracy theories. They had, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, they had people associated with communists, they had people associated with
Oh
right
yeah.
wing national populism and even neo Nazism, just basically doing reporting and journalism for them. Why? To demoralize Germany, to basically get to push their propaganda with an agenda to mentally or psychologically disarm the German public or a portion of them. Because once you have people that are believing these conspiracy theories, even if there are elements of truth in them, that's directed against their home governments, is really getting at the truth in governmental reform. Ultimately, the reason why an organization like RT, Russia Today Germany, or RT Deutsch or RTDE, they're not interested in just getting at the truth or propagating a form of journalism. They are weaponizing journalism as a propaganda tool to mentally disarm the German government and the German population, so it make them more amenable to Russian political and economic pressure. And the Russians have the same program here, and they weaponize the same thing. I mean, the truther movement, it's mirrors basically in tone and almost in content the same kind of propaganda that was used in the United States starting in about the end of the 1960s, well into the 1980s, that was attempting to cripple our CIA and FBI and our layers of protection to collect intelligence, to maintain internal security. And the communist movement, they weaponized groups here in the United States that were fronts of the Communist Party USA, like the National Lawyers Guild and the National Executive, no, the National Emergency Committee on Civil Liberties, which was an offshoot of the ACLU because they considered the ACLU too anti-communist. So this group, the NECLC, I think it was called, the National Emergency Committee on Civil Liberties, which split, I think, sometime in the 1950s or 1960s from the ACLU. And the purpose of those groups, they were weaponized by the communist movement to basically cripple our defense capabilities, our internal security capabilities. So that kind of propaganda where they were wrapping themselves up in the Constitution and claiming they're for liberty and free speech and everything, and we're against the deep state. Then it was the CIA and the
Mm,
military industrial complex. Why? Not because they wanted to reform them and curb very real abuses. They wanted to cripple it, put it in the grave so that this country is vulnerable. And let's not underestimate the issue of how free speech can be weaponized in the United States too as well. That's very, very important. Um, there's a very good book. I referenced the National Lawyers Guild, which was the Communist Party USA front. They still exist. Now they're not as much of a front. Now they just have, it's kind of a collection of radical leftists and communists of all stripes in the NLG. They'll defend every like convicted or suspected terrorist or subversive. So, a little history here. At a 1971 National Lawyers Guild convention, radical leftist lawyer William Kunstler proclaimed, "I am a double agent. I am using the system to bring down the system." 4 years later, Kunstler admitted that the purpose of his legal work was to, quote, keep the revolutionaries functioning. Rutgers University School of Law professor Arthur Kenoy, who is also a prominent member of the National Lawyers Guild, argued that the role of the radical lawyer was to weaken the legal system's ability to function effectively against subversives who sought to overthrow the capitalist system. This is some notes for an essay that are future essay. Future National Lawyers Guild President Paul Harris quoted Lenin when he stated his belief that a successful revolution required a, quote, legal struggle to exist alongside illegal militant revolutionary activity. Doris Bryn Walker, the president of the National Lawyers Guild from 1970 to 1971, argued that, quote, bourgeois democratic rights were valued as a tool to insulate the coming, quote unquote, Second American Revolution from government repression. Now, the founder of the American Civil Liberties Committee, American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, he counseled when forming the group, do steer away from making it look like a socialist enterprise. Too many people have gotten the idea that it is nine-tenths a socialist movement. We want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a good lot of flags, talk American flags, talk a good deal about the Constitution and what our forefathers wanted to make of this country, and to show that we are really the folks that really stand for the spirit of our institutions. So you have both sides weaponizing our Constitution and misusing it, I would argue. And that's why the former Justice Robert Jackson, he really wisely stated the choice is not between order and liberty. It is between liberty and order and anarchy without either. There is a danger that if the court the Supreme Court, that is, does not temper its doctrinaire logic with a little practical wisdom, it will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact. And the National Lawyers Guild, the ACLU, and others, they had the same kind of rhetoric back then when trying to paralyze our intelligence agencies. They use very similar rhetoric and themes as the truthers do today. And that's the issue with free speech. I love free speech. I don't like censoring voices that are opposed to mine. Look, I'm a librarian by profession and I manage a small library down here in South Florida. I don't like censorship, I'm allergic to it. But we also have to take into account the history that there are forces that will use free speech in order to bring it down. And neo Nazi groups and even the old Nazi party in Germany also had the same ideas too about using the Constitution and using classical liberalism and its inherent weaknesses and contradictions to basically collapse it. And big business will do the same thing in the United States too, and they're advocates in the Republican Party. For example, you have the Federalist Society, you have major corporations, including the woke corporations, like, for example, I see here Facebook, Microsoft, for example, Google. They gave money to an organization called the Federalist Society, which gives us judges like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy
Oh
Coney
God.
Barry and others. Why? Because they want to advance their interests. So woke corporation or libertarian or conservative corporations doesn't make a difference who they're going to back, because the Federalist Society is going to advance the interests of corporate capitalists, which want to make money at all costs. I'm not saying companies shouldn't make money, but it would make money based on just even not always doing the right thing by the American people or national security. One lawyer who's a big time Republican lawyer who hates any campaign finance reforms, you have James Bopp. He wanted to establish what was the Republican super PAC. He's like, when he got criticism about that, he says, Mr. Free Speech Warrior, the Supreme Court doesn't care, and I don't care, and the Federal Election Commission doesn't care, and no one that matters cares. You have, here you have regarding the H-1B visa program, which imports guest workers from foreign countries, including communist China, to work in American technology industries, and they undercut the wages of American workers,
Yeah, we
impose
got
a
used to
national
crazy.
security.
We became used
Yeah,
to crazy, and people can't distinguish
yeah,
anymore between normal and crazy, right? Because if you say, well,
yeah.
we'll just call in this, it's really insane and crazy to me if people say, well, we're gonna do this trade with the Chinese communists and we call it free trade. Well, it's not free trade. It's only
No,
you
no.
could call a section of it free once these
Yeah.
Chinese slaves have actually made the product and these crazy communist elites, they have sold the product. At some point it gets shipped over the ocean, and that shipment you could call free, right? Because you're just moving goods from one ocean to the other. But it's just calling the whole thing free trade is completely crazy. But we have gotten
Yeah.
used to crazy. People can't distinguish anymore. And just with all the other examples you just mentioned, I mean, like, people,
Well, I
Americans.
wanted to interject real quickly because on the other side, where free speech by the forces of the so called right are misinterpreted to as well and misused, you had Steve Ubel, the head of the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Groups, when there was a bill that was up on the Congress, which would allow the federal government to negotiate Medicare prices. Ubel, this head of the pharmaceutical big pharma lobby, said this is a very consequential vote. Those members who vote for this bill will not get a free pass. We'll do whatever we can to hold them accountable. What he's saying is they're weaponizing free speech basically to advance interests that are also can be very harmful for the American people. As Senator Robert Bennett, who is a corporate Democrat, admitted regarding the H-1B visas in the year 2000, there were, in fact, quote, whole lot of folks against the H-1B expansion bill, but because they are tapping the high-tech community for campaign contributions, they don't want to admit that in public. He said Tom Davis, the chair of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, admitted in 2000 this H-1B expansion legislation is not a popular bill with the public, it's popular with the CEOs. This is a very important issue for the high-tech executives who give the money. And I could list a lot of other quotes, and you're probably thinking, why is this important? Because this is one of the weaknesses of American society. You have terms that are used like freedom and liberty and free
Yeah,
markets and social justice and racial justice and this and that and everything else that are misused by the left and the right. And both the communist extremists, like we talked about the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild and the organized communist apparatus. And then the other swing, the other punch, the other pincher is big business too, as well, which will the Republicans will say. And this is where I know I'm going to upset a lot of people in our audiences, but this is where people like Bernie Sanders are right. The campaign contribution system is the Achilles heel in the United States, because even
crazy.
though you have the H-1B visa bills, which brings in security risk potentially, and there have been some H-1B visa holders who are from China who were actually caught for espionage and whatnot. Again, what it is that they're weaponizing free speech and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in an effort to ultimately overthrow it. Literally, in the case of the communists, forces, like with the National Lawyers Guild, for example, and then from elements of big business that may want to keep the Constitution in letter, but in reality want an illiberal system where they have control and they'll override any opposition by the fact they have a lot of money. They can hold money over the congressman or senator and say, you're not voting for that bill. If you want to have that nice cushy career as a congressman or a senator or a
Hmm.
political future, you're going to better vote for that bill. I don't care what the American people said. And that's what, remember, the big lawyer, Mr. Bob, said, I don't care what all these people think. I am God. Nothing is going to happen because I got tons of money and
Uh,
everything. You don't think, dude, you don't think the communists, the Russians, and the Chinese are not seeing this? Well, I provide tons of proof that they do see this. They understand for decades this aspect of American politics. And then on top of that, you have the crazies in both in Europe and the United States with their truthers. And they really also obfuscate the real issues that you and I are talking about, all their conspiracy theories and Alex
yeah.
Jones and everything else. They don't talk about this. This is the existential issues, the subversion from the communist side and the subversion from the alleged right, because I don't even view them as the right,
Yeah, I mean,
really.
just look at, just go on some person's social media channel, right? Super left wing guy, super right wing guy, man, woman, something else, doesn't matter. If you go to an very ideological, popular person, and you get into the comment section, or it's or maybe on Reddit or something, where people can actually talk to each other. If you contradict certain things, if you give if you say what's going wrong in that particular group, they will start hating. They will start hating you, and they will kick you out of that comment section real fast, or they will just all jump on you, even though
Mm-hmm.
they claim freedom of speech, freedom of the press. But the moment it touches their own agenda, it just puts their own plans in danger. They will get rid of you really fast, and this sort of behavior trickles down to the individual activists, because it's like in a cult, right? What does a cult do? They will tell the members, you're only allowed to do cult think. You're only allowed to consume stuff that's from the cult, that's sanctioned by the cult. You're not supposed to, get into any sort of criticism, any sort of other idea. If you do, you get punished or excluded from the cult. So it's like this. So if craziness is sort of what the influencers are spreading, these activists will then defend craziness, and people forgot where the difference was. What is normal these days? I mean, you saw that stuff on the Alex Jones program, where he started to say the spirit of 1776 is now in
Mm-hmm.
Russia. In Russia, are you serious? I mean, can you please start to compare Vladimir Putin with King George III? Can you
Yeah,
please
there's,
try to make a
there's no
comparison?
comparison.
Can you please try to make a comparison between the Russian Empire these days and, let's say, the British Empire or any other empire in the past? I mean, it's like it's an or they try to make it look like an aristocracy now in Russia, and America became independent from an aristocracy, a monarchy. People celebrate the 4th of July, right? The Independence Day. What did Americans became independent of? When they talk about liberty and freedom and more freedom, and they are all against tyranny, what exactly was the tyranny you got liberated from? So you have to understand the tyranny, otherwise you can't understand freedom. And so nowadays you see all these guys on the media, and they become more and more aristocratic and imperialist in their way of thinking, and that gives a boost to the left wing, of course, as well, because they think, oh, that's exactly what we've been warning about. And it's like people say things that make absolutely no sense whatsoever. They say the spirit of 1776, it's now in Russia, even though that is completely false. And then so there's other things as well. When there's a lot of complaints, especially in Western Europe, about the influx of Muslim migrants, right? So these
Mm-hmm.
pro-Russian guys are saying, well, Uncle Putin can liberate you if you do it like the Russians do it. If you attach yourself to the Russians, no more Muslim migrants. You will not have a Muslim, Islamist problem anymore. Well, guess what? There's a whole lot of Muslim migrants in Russia. The youth, it becomes more and more Muslim. The armed forces of Russia become more and more Muslim. Is anybody talking about that? Any kind of pro-Russian influencer? No, they don't mention that, or they make some sort of excuse for it. It's like this craziness has become the new normal, and you cannot really deal with a crazy person. That is kind of the problem. And so it's easy to get into a cult, but it's hard to get somebody out of a cult. And that has been researched as well, because anybody can join an insurgency. Anybody can join an insurgency movement, but also anybody can join or build a counterinsurgency movement. And this is ultimately what we need. And we cannot let the government handle this, because there's too many problems in government. We cannot hand that task fully over to the government. Oh, please, federal government, do this counterinsurgency for us. We all have to be involved in that. And this comes down to the average activist and influencer out there, because there's some. I mean, you put some quotes in there that I hadn't even seen yet in your paper, where I'm thinking, what are these guys smoking? I mean, are they huffing glue? I mean, what? People celebrate that nonsense. And you also quote studies, these polls, this opinion research that has been done. Such a percentage of Americans would just surrender to the Soviet Union. They wouldn't even fight. They would just choose the option to surrender. So can you find a million idiots in America, or 3 million idiots in America who would take up arms against a republic, against freedom? Sure you can. And imagine 3 million troops. How many soldiers does the United States military has? So it becomes an actual physical problem, a physical threat. And it's like when you look at these influencers and some guys that you mention, I mean, it's very noticeable that some of these pro-Russian influencers, they tend to repeat a fixed set of talking points. So somebody is creating these talking points. So somebody is in charge, apparently, of making up these points. And then you see this one influencer saying exactly these things, and the other guy saying exactly these things. They don't really add anything to it. They don't leave anything really away. they just follow the script, and then this is what's being taught to these followers out there, and they start using the same script. And they don't care if it's illogical. They don't care if it's completely against the facts, because panic. Because everybody's panicked, everybody's concerned, everybody's depressed, and then it's like this paradoxical propaganda where people say, well, the conspiracy is so strong, the conspiracy is everywhere, they can do anything. But at the same time, they will claim, well, the system is weak, we can take it over. Our weird, agenda, our little, or our insurgency has the best chances to succeed because we have Putin behind us, we have the Chinese behind us. It's a done deal. We can just do this. The final victory is just around the corner. And this is kind of the biggest activist scam of them all. By telling these activists they have the best chances of success, right? It's easy peasy. We're gonna do this, no problem, right? So just commit to the cause, talk about the cause, get yourself dirty, get yourself involved, so you can never live a normal life again, because everybody thinks you're crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and let's talk a little bit about Alex Jones because, and I mentioned this in my book, Turning the Page, My Evolution from Conservatism to Radical Civic Nationalism. And I talk about a lot of research about different topics. And what was interesting about Alex Jones, was that initially when he started out broadcasting, there are video clips, I don't know if they still exist, but they used to exist, where he was actually calling Vladimir Putin a agent of international communism.
KGB demon.
Yes, KGB demon, that Putin was on, quote, an unbelievable power trip, and claimed that he was known as Vladimir the Ruthless. And he said, according to Jones's 9/11 coverage, I'm reading this here, the, quote, New World Order crowd armed China, quote, who in turn armed Iran and Pakistan. Russia is playing possum, telling us they're our friends while they roll out new supersonic long-range Topol M mobile missiles we can't pick off in a nuclear war. Media is telling us they're our friends when their own papers, they're laughing at us, arming our enemies, signing deals with the Taliban the day of the attack. Dude, this guy sounds like J.R. Nyquist.
Yeah,
Back when he worked
sure.
on WorldNet Daily and Newsmax at the time. He is Nyquist, basically. And then all of a sudden, during the time about the time of the Russian attack on Georgia, that's when Alex Jones really changed his tune. And what's weird, what I found, and I don't, I'm sorry if I'm insinuating anything, but I just find it very strange that according to an allegation made in the testimony of Robin Drew, who was a former news director at InfoWars, Alex Jones met with, quote, Daria, the Russian operative in the office. So, there's a lot of what's a marker of possible concern is individuals that would take a position that is very critical and concerned about Russia and China. I read to you in the audience, I know you know this, Alex, but to the audience, where Jones was sounding like J.R. Nyquist at one point, and he does such a 360, and now the term Daria, well, that's a Russian woman's name, but the Russian operative, like, what is going on at InfoWars? What was going on? That to me, that's like the news story that everyone should be investigating, but nobody's investigating it. And I got to tell you, this is where I think our friend Jean Rabin also has a point. Why are people like J.R. Nyquist and Trevor Loudon not like put front and center on the TV? To be honest, these are people. I mean, these are news stories. I mean, what in the
Yeah.
world is going on with a Russian operative in Alex Jones's office? That's a big deal.
Well, they
That's a
become
question that should be answered.
these.
Why? Because he is spreading information that many Americans who are patriotic really lap it up and take it in as truth.
I mean, these
And
guys
look, there are
become
some.
these guys like
Yeah,
Jones, I
I
mean,
mean,
they've become slaves to their own audience, and they've become slaves to the current trend, right? Because in the Bush era, this was sort of like the golden era of Alex Jones. Let's say from 1997 in the beginning, and then of course the Bush years from 2000 to 2008. This was the golden era of Infowars, and I remember it was trendy at the time to be not so ideological, right? You know, just this was kind of the underlying current at Infowars, telling people be for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It doesn't matter if you used to be more right wing or left wing. Just find common ground and don't listen to these crazies on Fox News, trashing Muslims from dawn from dawn to dusk or whatever. Just everybody work with each other. This was kind of a trend because people got so tired of the Bush admin, and so he was following a trend. And there were many people who became quite famous during the Bush years. I mean, this was also people on the left like Jon Stewart, I believe, and some others. They had an easy job. They just needed to trash the Bush admin. They was just talking about foreign military bases and the foreign wars and the military industrial complex and the corruption and blah blah blah, and the Patriot Act. So it was a very easy job that influencers had at the time, and it was also very easy for Alex Jones to do that job. He only had to use some bits and pieces that he once read from Bird Society books. That was kind of his foundation. And he had a fairly easy job. But then a shift happened in 2008, not just with the Russian effort, but also with the Democrats. Because when the Democrats were in the White House, Jones's previous, the trend was over, and Jones's previous current, there was not much demand for it anymore because people thought, oh my God, the Democrats are taking over. We need some more hardcore right-wing line. And these activists were getting frustrated, I think, even the followers of Jones, because they didn't get the results that they wanted. I mean, they didn't get a new proper investigation of 9/11. They didn't get new people, better people in office. There was no real progress there. There was a lot of talk, but not a lot of substance, right? And this is kind of the biggest critique, I guess, with Alex Jones. I mean, what actual political career has he truly helped? I mean, was there any great politician that was really pushed by Alex Jones over the years? And so people got frustrated. They wanted something new. And so then came other influencers and even more mainstream guys, and they became more popular because they were getting soft on Russia. They were saying that, well, maybe the Russians are our friends. Maybe the Russians are now the anti-communists. And isn't it a nice sounding idea that we have powerful friends over there? And also, it was popular to have connections with the Republican Party because people thought, well, you have to, work with the Republican Party. So Jones kind of went with the trend. He just shifted whichever way the wind was blowing. And so that became sort of an escalating thing because you become a slave of your audience. If you never teach your audience what really matters, the audience will follow trends and they will demand these trends. And somebody like Alex Jones is replaceable. And this goes for any sort of traditional conspiracy influencer out there. They're interchangeable. They all sound the same, so you can replace them. There's a whole menu of people you can choose from. So when this one guy is not following the new trend, you just go to the next guy, right? So I think this was one dynamic. And we saw that even later with the Q movement, when Jones became very irate that these Q guys were taking away his market share. And he was putting out these shows complaining, I'm the original guy. I was there in the mid-90s when nobody wanted to listen to this stuff. I was there in 1997. I was on air on the day of 9/11 talking about all this stuff. And now these young guys are taking my market share. These guys who don't have any real connections. And he even had a debate with the Q shaman. It's this younger guy. He's much, much younger than Jones, much better looking than Jones, also has no real idea about anything. And so Jones was getting pissed, really pissed, because this shaman was talking like a politician. He wouldn't really say anything, but it
Mm-hmm.
sounded nice.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a better looking
Yeah.
younger guy. So Jones was becoming more and more pissed. But the question really
Mm-hmm.
was, what makes Jones better than the Q shaman? What, because the Q guys, they were, reading these cryptic postings on a joke message board, reading the tea leaves of what is about to happen, creating this cult. And Jones was having guests on, like Dr. Steve Pachinik, saying the same thing almost like the Q guys, that a secret team is working to arrest the Democrats. And, like, these guys are interchangeable. So I think this one big aspect, when the Russians put in so much effort to convince the world Russia is anti-communism, it changes the trend. So even if Jones never signed anything with the Russians, even in the case that Jones was never really in bed with the Russians were changing. The Russians were changing the trends. The Russians had the bigger power over the conspiracy movement. And so Jones pretty much followed the new trend. And when it comes to direct influence, we had a case a few months ago in Germany. This was one of the highest regarded, most successful journalists in the country. His name was Hubert Seipel. And so he had these books out, books on Putin. He had a very significant television documentary out in 2012, very, very soft on the Russians. And he got exclusive access to Vladimir Putin when nobody else could. This was 2 years before the taking of Crimea, so no Western journalist had that kind of access to Putin. So that guy was invited over. He was allowed to go on a private hunting trip with Putin. They were riding in the same cars. They were like old friends, like for some strange reason. And so people were starting to get concerned when they saw this documentary, and they said, well, it kind of sounds like total Russian propaganda, because there's like this weird undertone that NATO expansion kind of maybe sort of is like the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. They basically did it like this. They talked about the Nazi invasion and how it affected the family of Vladimir Putin. His entire family almost died. And then they talk some judo stuff with Putin for a minute, and then they make that point. They insinuate that NATO is maybe, or the NATO expansion is maybe sort of like the Nazi invasion. I'm like, what is this crap? And then the Seipel guy was asked on a radio show, well, have you ever taken Russian money? It's just a blunt question, right? Have you ever taken Russian money? And this guy was furious. How dare you insinuate this stuff? I mean, this is unbelievable that somebody would insinuate this thing. Fast forward a couple of years, he actually gets caught because some database was hacked, or some documents were hacked, and there was a contract. They called it a sponsoring contract. This was for a single book project of this guy. He got an extra cool 600,000 euros. 600,000 euros for one book project. Now, we don't know if any other contracts exist, but the existing contract that we know about basically mentions that there are other projects that they had with this guy. So we're talking these kind of numbers here. And so that exists as well. That also exists. And when Alex Jones was expanding his operations, I mean, he was hiring so many people, buying a new studio, buying all the fancy gear. And so now he had a payroll. He had like 70 people to pay each and every single month. And he was competing now with people out there who didn't have any money, right? There were some guys that were making hilariously bad content about the Sandy Hook shooting, and they got millions of views for a shoddy, cheap video that cost almost nothing to make. So Jones was thinking probably, I have to compete with that now? How can I compete with this stuff? So the only way to compete, if you're an interchangeable activist, is, well, I gotta have a fancier production so I can distinguish myself. It needs to look better. And I also need contacts. The more Russian contacts I have and the more Republican contacts I have, the more attractive I seem, because that's what the little guy on the web doesn't have. So that was another factor in this. And there was even something in the news a couple of days ago. This was JD Vance speaking at an organization that was sort of tied, I think, to the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. And Vance was saying something like, yeah, I appreciate Alex Jones because it's sort of useful for us. So I'm like,
Yeah,
it's
there's like this Jones is, he Jones and his ilk and his ideas, they do have a hold upon a portion of the Republican Party and the MAGA movement, the MAGA Republicans, which is unfortunate. I remember Steve Plzenik. I remember him, ex-CIA officer and whatnot. And many of these individuals from the right feed the Russian narrative, just like Philip Agee and Phil Rodinger and Ralph McGehee and Victor Marchetti back in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s were feeding the old Soviet narrative. In some cases, they even worked with Soviet friends or for communist intelligence services. And my concern is now portions of the conspiracy-oriented right, they're deploying the same themes that the anti-CIA, anti-FBI left utilized back in the 1970s and much of the 1980s. With similar ends, whatever their intentions are or were. And that's very concerning because a portion of the Trump Republican Party does have this base or group of voter base and that subscribe to what you had termed this sort of truth or interpretation of history and current events. Of course, there's going to be grains of truth, and there is no doubt about it. But what is the purposes for the Russians glomming on to this current of opinion? It's certainly not to make the United States, in my opinion, a better place to live and to make our government function in a more transparent way. It's to basically collapse our government and collapse our society and further demoralize the United States. And I believe that's why the Russians, with that piece of information that I shared about Daria, the Russian operative, whether Alex Jones is recruited or not, I mean, that is an important topic. We don't know. We don't have access to that information, but it's indicative that the Russians have targeted Alex Jones and whatnot. And he has had Alexander Dugin and the late Lyndon LaRouche on his program, and he treated them like, from what I recall correctly, as credible guests. And I'm not saying people should be disrespectful for their guests. I talk to people that I virulently disagree with, but I do that in order to learn things from them and gain knowledge and understanding of why the other side does different things, why political radicals do their things, they believe in what they believe in, and why they decided to take that political path. That's important. So I'm not necessarily upset with Jones having people, radicals on his show. My concern is he really, it all ties together. He views them as
there was no
legitimate
criticism.
political.
There was no nothing that was countering Dugin in any way.
Exactly, correct. And that's the thing. They were, and it ties in with Alex Jones's, overall picture of the conduct of Russian foreign policy and Russia's intentions. And that's my concern. And that has a hold on people. And I think one of the biggest turning points where we went wrong is not only in the late 1980s when Gorbachev and his comrades in the Communist Party Soviet Union launched a campaign to deprive Russia of the enemy image, essentially, whereas to disarm Western and American public opinion to convince them that the Soviet Union was mellowing, that it was no longer a hostile power. But it was also when the Democratic Party, and particularly the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, was claiming that Trump was a Russian asset. And because the rhetoric and that campaign was so aggressive and so pushy, rightfully or wrongfully, that it antagonized many Republicans and many right wing populists and MAGA voters to the point where well, if the liberals are hate Russia so much, and the nature of so-called conservatism, the Republican Party, more than anything else, is to own the liberals. Well, if we want to own the liberals and crap all over the Democrats, well, the
Hmm.
Russians can't be so bad now.
Yeah.
So I would argue that the Russians paid attention to that dynamic of MAGA and the Republican Party, that then they decided to take advantage of that. And they already kind of had a campaign and a certain support in certain quarters in the American right, like Alex Jones, like Michael Savage. Michael Savage was another one who did a very big about face on Russia. I've talked about that with Jimmy from Brooklyn, or a friend here in the United States. I've talked with him privately about that. Um, and it really gained steam, this notion where at one time Mitt Romney was saying in 2012, really, that Russia is a geopolitical threat. He said that in his debate with Obama.
Yeah.
And Mr. Obama, of course, said, well, Mr. Romney has his foreign policy back in the 1980s.
Hmm.
It's the 1980s all over again. Hey, Mitt Romney, Cold War is dead. Although Mitt Romney in the Republican platform, which he was the leader of the Republican, quote unquote, at that point, Republican Party, they were also saying we should give permanent normal trade relations with the Russians. And of course, that's what I call the conservative two step, say
Yeah.
one thing, do another. But anyway, so what happened was, is after, during and after the Hillary campaign, you had this about face within conservative and Republican opinion, or a part of it, which then is like, well, Russia can't be bad because the liberals hate Russia, and they hate it because they're Christian and they're nationalists and they're manly and they're against girly men and femboys and everything else, and against the quote LGBTQ plus agenda. So Russia can't be bad after all. Now, they're tradcons or traditionalist conservatives, so
Yeah.
they can't be bad. And that really, the Democrats really shot themselves in the foot and really killed opportunities and harmed people like us who have long been concerned about the Russian national security threat to the United States. And now all of a sudden, it's like they gain a foothold in the Republican Party. And that's where we can bring our discussion into J.D. Vance. And I'll let you speak, and I got to get a drink of water too while we talk. I have the computer loud enough. Where I have a lot of concerns about J.D. Vance. There are things I really like about him, like his economic views, which he has changed since Hillbilly Elegy, by the way. He has done a bit of an about face on economics. He's more closer to me on economics than, say, Trump's former vice presidential nominee, later American Vice President Mike Pence, who was a disaster on so many fronts. But and Vance seems to be good on China. There is some contradictory evidence that was brought to my attention, but generally speaking, Vance has had a clear understanding of the threat of China. But all of a sudden, here's an example of what I said, the successful Russian campaign, and where the Democrats totally screwed things up, of course, by linking Trump with Russia. Now you have somebody like Senator J.D. Vance, saying, well, who cares? I could care less about Ukraine and whether it falls and whatnot. And there's this idea within the MAGA camp, Steve Bannon, for example, that we could split Russia from China. And my
Yeah.
concern is that you have that. Now you have good guys like Peter Navarro, one of the few great people that was in the first Trump administration. And, J.R. Nyquist brought up in the last anti-communist roundtable, Mr. O'Brien, who is being tapped in potentially for being Secretary of State or someone somewhere in the National Security Council. So there is good, but the problem is if if it was me, and I know as an activist, as an author, and as a podcaster, it's easy for me to say this because I'm not in contact with the political realities, but I understand the political realities. But to me, I think a lot of these people that really just absolutely love Russia, they need to be dumped overboard or at least given a briefing And if they just can't see the reality, they have no business in government. I mean,
Well, this, I
Russia's an
mean,
existential threat. Go ahead,
when
Alex. I'm sorry.
Vance was making this transition from a soldier to a guy who graduates from Yale. I think he even married another Yaley, and he sort of transformed his whole life, became a politician. That's when people started to crawl all over him, trying to influence him and telling him, oh, you should read this, you should have that conviction, and you should be following this book and that book. I mean, there's a guy who was an influence on him, and that other guy was influenced by this German author, Mr. Hoppe, who was a radical libertarian, like somebody who wants absolutely no government whatsoever. And this Hoppe guy, he's like a the libertarian Karl Marx, so to say, because he spends most of his time
Yeah.
trashing the status quo, just complaining about everything. Then he presents his utopia, his dream society, where everything works out just fine. And then, as an intermediate transition period, he advocates for an aristocracy because he says aristocrats, they owned the land and they basically owned the people, so they took care of their own property. And so this is like Karl Marx, who was also complaining about the status quo most of the time, spent most of his time on that. Then he presented his communist utopia, and then he said something like, well, as a transition, we need some sort of a dictatorship. This was also Leninism. We need a dictatorship for quite a while to secure the revolution, and one day we're going to have our utopia. And so there's all kinds of people crawling all over J.D. Vance trying to influence him. And I think that also happened during Yale because he had a certain status at Yale that you would normally find with a person who is attached to the Yale secret societies. Now, I think the danger in these student societies at Yale and some other places, I think there's a real danger of very old networks that go back to Britain. I think from a counterintelligence perspective, there you could probably find a lot of stuff there. It's not just the frat boy stuff. It's not just drinking until you're hammered out of your mind. It's I mean, that's kind of the bonding element to it. You party with these people, and only when they like you, when they like having you around, that's when they get you into the society or further in this further up the ladder. And then if you leave Yale and you were part of these secret societies or student societies, they can get you, they can get the foot in the door for you into politics or business. So it's like there's so many people who wanted that spot that ultimately went to J.D. Vance. So why did he get the spot? Was he just better than everybody else? Was he smarter, more likable? Or was there some kind of loyalty to an older network that's tied to the Yale University? And especially with the Skull and Bones Society, these Skull and Bones guys, they tended to make a lot of or do a lot of commerce with the Soviet Union and also later with China. I think almost every American ambassador to China was from Skull and Bones. And so it's like this very interesting situation where a guy rises up in politics and you wonder who made that possible. Because some people don't want to be visible in public. They just want to find the new guy, try to control the new guy, and then prop him up to be a big political figure. And so sometimes it's more subtle, sometimes it's more overt. And I think he's the kind of guy who would like aspects of Project 2025, this aristocratic strain or that authoritarian stance. And so somebody may have been grooming him for all this time. And I think he's hard to read because he flip-flopped on the MAGA movement and on Trump himself. He positioned himself, and I mean, it's something you have to expect in politics because you need the voters, you need to draw them in. I think it's very hard to understand. He's very hard to read, and especially if we project into the future, who's gonna continue to influence him, and what's he gonna do when he gets the security clearance and gets to read actual real intelligence?
Yeah, no, I think you make a very interesting point about the the Yale societies and whatnot. And look, I don't dislike the elites because they may have more money or influence. It's again, I have to make this clear. Uh, because it's an important distinction. My concern is I have a problem fundamentally with more powerful people picking on people with less power for no other reason other than to gain wealth and status at another group's events. And at the same time, I would argue and have argued even in my essay paper on what is radical civic nationalism on my Substack, my view of the elites versus the masses and masses for the elites is simply that one of the jobs of our new constitutional or reform constitutional system that I would argue for in the United States is that the government should protect the weak against the unfair and just gross depredations wrought by the economic and political elites on the one hand. So the masses need a protector. And that's where government can play a role in the system as I envision it, which is basically built upon the fundamentals of the original US Constitution. Now, on the other side of the equation, uh, I also argue against mass democracy, essentially, where if you have the elites, the economic elites, also need a protective force against the depredation by extremist groups and personalities who claim that they want to, in the name of the masses, that we want to bring social justice and fairness, or we want to overthrow capitalism and everything else, and thereby eventually, after using and exploiting these economic elites, disposing them literally physically. So I think the economic elites at the same time also need to be protected against the depredation of anti capitalist extremism. So I'm against that kind of mass democracy or mass anti capitalism too. Why? Because we know the body counts, we know the deprivation of liberties for everybody. And I explain that in very briefly in one of my where I talk about the various points of radical civic nationalism. So and that's with an understanding of history. Now, concerning, I think you touch upon a very good point about when you were talking about the quote, various elite student societies and Yale and other elite university. There's a gentleman, the former New York Times journalist Chris Hedges. He wrote a very good book called America the Farewell Tour. And he is a radical leftist, but he's kind of heterodox when you really dig and look at some of his positions. He is against the communists and he's spoken very critical, even though his position is very anti US on a lot of things and anti US establishment and against neoconservative interventionism. And he's kind of like a Noam Chomsky, but he is sharper in his criticisms of the radical left. And I can read quotes in another show from him where he sounds like you, me, and J.R. Nyquist when he really addresses the deprivations and the tyrannies exacted by revolutionary leftists throughout the world and the nature of radicalism from the Nazis and the communists. So, to give a little background really for who Chris Hedges is, he's kind of an unusual radical leftist. I would term him an Emma Goldman socialist type, if you will, who has the integrity to go against, like Emma Goldman did, Bolshevik tyranny and had to flee Bolshevik Russia for her life. So he recalled that Chris Hedges went at the age of 10. I was sent as a scholarship student to a boarding school for the uber rich in Massachusetts. I lived amongst the wealthiest Americans for the next 8 years, and what he discovered was very fascinating. And I think, when we talk about the elites, this is where I have a problem where Alex Jones and even the John Birch Society, and there are many things I did like when I was a member of the John Birch Society, but other things I've come to disagree with them. And I think they really don't educate people about, and they're about really what motivates elements of this economic and political elite here, or this American so called aristocracy. And they don't go into the depth. They tend to just talk about conspiracy. And yes, these are, in their view, bad people or malevolent conspirators, but they really don't get into the meat and potatoes where people like Chris Hedges or Christopher Lash or the former Republican congressional aide, Mr. Lofgren, Lofgren, I forget his first name, talked about. Well, this is what Chris Hedges talks about. I listened to their prejudices and saw their cloying sense of entitlement. They insisted they were privileged and wealthy because they were smarter and more talented. They had a sneering disdain for those ranked below them in a material and social status, even the merely rich. Most of the uber rich lacked the capacity for empathy and compassion. They formed elite cliques that hazed, bullied, and taunted any nonconformist who defied or did not fit into their self adulatory universe. It was impossible to build a friendship with most of the sons of the uber rich. Friendship for them was defined by what's in it for me. They were surrounded from the moment they came out of the womb by people catering to their desires and needs. They were incapable of reaching out to the others in distress. Whatever petty whim or problem they had at the moment dominated their universe and took precedence over the suffering of others, even those within their families. They knew only how to take. They could not give. They were deformed and deeply unhappy people in the grip of an unquenchable
Hmm.
narcissism. And this is confirmed the way one of the methods that I figured out that Hedges was telling the truth. It was some of the personal experience that I had. I went to an elite private school. I liked a good portion of the students there, some of whom I'm still friendly with. But there were others that I will say fits Hedges' description. It was, and I got a great education. I liked most of the teachers and all the rest of it. But yeah, and there are other scholars like Christopher Lash, and I think his first name was Robert Lofgren, who is a former Republican congressional aide who's written a number of books describing his experiences with Republicans and their interactions with the super wealthy elite, and they talk about how they live. They want to create this toll booth economy, and yeah, you talked about Hans Hermann Hoppe and other libertarians, you're right. They do have this sort of
Class warfare,
aristocratic view, and not
libertarian
the
class warfare.
libertarian class warfare. And it's not the type of aristocracy that Jeff supports, which is an aristocracy of merit and morality and fealty to the public interest and whatnot. This is an aristocracy based on money and property. And when you look at the ideas of Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand, who made good points on certain issues, including historical points that really need to be considered. But when you look at some of their private correspondence and letters, they have that same kind of class based arrogance that comes from the neoliberal or free market right, which tends to glorify the entrepreneur, which is what the Proud Boys, the paramilitary right wing libertarian organization, they call for glorifying the
Mm.
entrepreneur and everything else. And that's what the libertarians do. They glorify the entrepreneur to the detriment of everybody else. They're rich. They glorify the super wealthy to the detriment of other people. Why? Because whenever someone proposes, even within the right, like lately J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, think tanks and publications like the American Compass, the libertarian, and when they talk about these
Yeah.
organizations and senators that limits on the power of private sector oligarchs, the libertarians and many so-called conservatives, they get into a tizzy and
Yeah.
say they're
It's like
stupid,
it's like
they don't
I
know anything about economics. And to me, where I would argue is that you need to have a balance with both sides. You can't have the private sector oligarchs as defined by as discussed by Chris Hedges and others having this tremendous amount of power. Why? because that's going to really muck up the system and ultimately muck up the national security system, because the decisions that this elite, as described by Hedges, they're going to undertake is very blind to the national interest. They're only framing it within their
Yeah.
own self
I mean,
preservation while
um,
neglecting the needs of the country. Go
so,
ahead.
when I read Hoppe's book, I mean, I could tell that he concocted his own system of class warfare. He basically says that Karl Marx didn't get it right. He didn't really understand the true classes and the true conflict between the classes. Hoppe says it's the productive classes versus the unproductive classes, right? And so this became sort of this destabilizing ideology. You're supposed to hate the other group. You're supposed to hate these, as he calls it, unproductive classes. But as we mentioned in the show that we did about Project 2025, I mean, there's so many Americans so many Americans who make things work every single day. They have the work ethic, and there's people out there with 2-3 jobs, and they have kids, so they have all these qualities that are always being talked about by libertarians and some very rich people. They have the stamina. They're inventive. They have a high sense of loyalty to the people around them. Super hardworking, but it's still not enough for the average person to make it, to be comfortable, at least to be comfortable,
Yes.
let alone to be really secure and comfortable. And so it's like that's one aspect of it. It's like you can preach all day about the virtues and all that stuff, but a lot of people have these virtues, but it's not good enough in the world they live in. And the other thing I noticed is that there's different ideologies. They have a different look on groups of people. So, for example, the left wanted to glorify the workers class and the peasants, right? So this was the saint-like oppressed class that would rise up and form a dictatorship and then have this utopia. But the problem is there's also a lot of psychos and a lot of bad people in the peasant class. That's just how it is, and
Yes.
we saw that in the Russian Revolution. For the most part, Russia did communism to itself. I mean, sure, there was foreign influence and some very secret influences too, but for the most part, these Russian peasants, they signed contracts with the Red Army and they started to shoot other Russians and tortured other Russians. And so it's like when you talk about the peasant class, I've been born into the peasant class, or maybe if I check, maybe it's slightly above the peasant class, but not that much. So I encountered a lot of, let's say, peasant class people who had that sort of mindset that you just quoted, a mindset that was attributed to the rich, sort of this very condescending, very illoyal, what's in it for me. That's also a mindset you can find among the peasant class. And so you can talk about the people all day long, but you have to be very specific what you're looking for, especially when you become more knowledge about the empires and different people in society. Now, before the show, we talked a little bit about my family, which was sort of peak Nazi. I mean, you couldn't get more Nazi than that, right? So there's this one guy in my family who was sort of like the highest ranking NSDAP party member in all of Bavaria. And so he was a nobody. This was a family, kind of a middle class family. Everybody was an engineer. That's what kind of all the men in the family were. But they had no powerful connections. They had no aristocratic titles, just very common people. And this one ancestor of mine, Theo Benesch, he was a young kid in World War I. He joined the fight. He was fighting on different fronts in the war. And apparently he posed on these photos, sending them as postcards to his family, smoking a cigarette and playing the tough guy, the cool guy, when he was like 18 or 19. He was a kid. But he fought in the war, and then he became this fanatical National Socialist. He was just a very common guy. He did not have any special skills for government, no intelligence skills, no higher military skills whatsoever. But this was sort of the big marketing trick of the Nazis, the Nazi movement. That's why it was so successful, because they promised, we're going to be building a new aristocracy, but everybody could become a member of it. It doesn't matter if you're a common person. If you joined the movement early, like my ancestor, you can become a fairly high-ranking guy. And we have photos of this man sitting in front of his gigantic desk. I mean, he wanted a Stalin-sized desk where he could sit on his chair and order people around. And he had this big limousine. He had this big black limousine and a chauffeur and everything. So he loved that. And this is kind of like how subversive movements, how they market themselves. If you join the revolution and you serve us, you can make it really far in that movement, despite having a lack of certain skills, not having powerful contacts before, not being an aristocrat. You can become a big shot. And it's like, this is kind of the people, right? I mean, the people were joining, the regular peasant class people were joining the Nazi movement, and it was terrible. It always depends on who's doing it and how you're doing it. So this is why standard ideologies are not as useful as people think they are, because every ideology claims to understand human evil better than everybody else, and they all claim to solve human evil, even though their ideas are crazy. The communists said evil comes from the small family, the patriarchal small family, private possessions. That's where evil comes from, and so if we destroy that, we destroy evil. The Nazis said it's race-based, right? So if you have the right ethnic makeup, then you're one of the good guys and everybody else needs to die. So this is how we defeat evil. This is how the Nazis define good and evil. And so, there's so many ideologies out there calling for chaos, really. I mean, I saw this with radical libertarians. And in the higher classes, you can find decent people, or you can find reasonable people who are wealthy. And I understand how hard it is to build something, to build a community that will last. And of course, they want to defend their community, and they want to keep it exclusive. Not everybody can join, and they want to vet people that join the community. And this takes time. This happens at Yale University, the student societies, the drinking, the partying. This is all part of the vetting process, because they don't want friction. They want this sort of group mentality where everybody's on the same page. And so over the years, I mean, I'm 40 now, right? So over the years, I became more quote unquote elitist, but I really wanted to nail down the principles that we have to master. It's not all about money. It's not all about who you know, but it's just or your perceived status. But there's a certain set of things that you need to understand to get out of this peasant mentality and not fall into the standard elitist mentality. But in terms of mass movements and ideologies, and we're for the people, I've experienced some pretty horrible people from the peasant class. And so it's not good enough to just pick an ideology that's marketed to you, that just has analyzed your type of personality, because that's what the Nazis did. They understood psychology. They read everything they could find on human psychology, and that's how they built their movement. And the communists, they even had stolen earlier research from Germany as far back as the 1850s. There was kind of this new field of psychology and developmental psychology, and there was even data on common Germans visiting a shrink in the 1850s and 1860s. So the communists understood how the German mind worked, what the problems were in an average German family, the internal conflicts and the mindsets. And this is how they marketed their ideology. So it's dangerous stuff, right? It's like a drug. It's like something that it's like a drug that will make you feel more alive and more connected and excited, but it has these withdrawal effects, and it has other various dangerous side effects, and it's like it can make you really miserable really fast, and then you need more of the drug, and this is how this gigantic insurgency or multifaceted insurgency movement is built like.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And this is one of the things, there are two parts to this. And this is why I wanted to clarify my view of the role of government in maintaining and protecting both the economic elites as well as the masses, if you will, too, as well, from depredations by other sides. And this is where Ludwig von Mises had a point. I think he generalized too much in his one of his many famous books, The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. It is offered for free through a variety of platforms, including Ludwig von Mises Institute in Alabama. And I urge people to read it. It's not one of his longer books. It's well written, like most of his books, highly intelligent man. And he argued that the opposition to the entrepreneur, the executive from the common man, stemmed from envy and resentment. And I don't think that's entirely true, but I think it's definitely partially true. And I don't want to. I know you mentioned stuff about your family, and Theo Benisch has a Wikipedia page in German. I encourage people to read through it to familiarize yourself. But von Mises makes a point that the ideas of the revolutionaries and reformers found approval with the immense majority of ignorant people exclusively driven by the most powerful human passions of envy and hatred. And there's a lot I'm going to be reading here because I want the reader to understand where I'm coming from. But von Mises also had a point. As much as I am very critical of him in my writings and my show, this is an area where he does have at least a big kernel of truth. There is a portion of these men and women who, they might be an engineer like Theo Benisch was, for example, or others, but there was always this latent desire or dreaminess to advance more, but maybe they didn't know how, they didn't have the requisite personality, or there was something that was blocking them either from society or even from within themselves, or a combination of the both. So I think that's part of it. You can't underestimate there is amongst elements of all classes, including the working class and the middle class, there are some elements that do have envy, particularly within intellectuals. And that's something that, in particular, von Mises pointed out vis-a-vis with intellectuals outside of his camp of thinking. And you can't underestimate that. That's where, as much as I'm very critical of libertarianism, you have to also be open-minded and fair and detect the points and arguments that they make that have more than kernels of truth. The other part, combined with the envy, which is extremely passionate and can reach toxic proportion, is this also issue of human beings want a sense of community as well as being individuals. And when you're in free societies, one of the challenges is a lot of loneliness, rootlessness. Are situations where many people, on the other hand, who have multiple jobs and still can't make ends meet. They can't start families. They can't pursue ventures outside of work that can help them better themselves or contribute something to society and maybe even develop a new entrepreneurial venture. I'm of the opinion that we really should not have an economic system, a type of capitalism, which basically where people are forced to work more than one job in order to afford basic needs. And that's one thing that I find that very dangerous for this country, and why people are so pissed off about capitalism and also our plutocratic government. And, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a New Deal liberal who served as President Kennedy's special assistant, he was a historian. And he really also had a penetrating analysis of totalitarianism, just like von Mises had a lot of penetrating analysis of totalitarianism, really some good points. He also said, against the loneliness and rootlessness of man in free society, the totalitarian state promises the security and comradeship of a crusading unity propelled by a deep and driving faith. The fear of isolation, the flight from anxiety lie at the bottom of the totalitarian appeal. And he said, through this century, in the 20th century, and I would argue it continues in the 21st century, Free society has been on the defensive, demoralized by the infection of anxiety, staggering under the body blows of fascism and communism. Free society alienates the lonely and uprooted masses, while totalitarianism, building on their frustrations and cravings, provides a structure of belief, men to worship and men to hate, and rights which guarantees salvation. So we have that combined with von Mises' at least partial good points about the envy, the intoxicating envy. You combine that, and you get a very, very powerful brew from the alienated intellectuals of many stripes, particularly of the radical stripe, for one reason or another. And I think that's where Theo Banish may come into play, because there's a book, it's authored by Milton Meyer, called They Thought They Were Free, The Germans 1933 to 1945, published in 1966. And he said wrote that one German recalled to him about the Volksgemeinschaft, the class solidarity of the Volksgemeinschaft. Never mind that the National Socialists, the top levels, were incredibly corrupt beyond belief. Never mind that. But they said, this one German said, for the first time in my life, I was really the peer of men who, in the Kaiser's time and in the Weimar time, had always belonged to classes lower or higher than my own. Men whom one had always looked down on or up to, but never at. In the labor front, I represented the Teachers Association. I came to know such people at first hand, to know their lives and to have them know mine. National Socialism broke down that separation, that class distinction. Democracy, such democracy as we had, didn't do it, and it is not doing it now, meaning in the West German Republic. Wiedenkind, a baker, told Milton Meyer that, quote, we simple working class men stood side by side with learned men in the labor front. And the reason why I'm reading all of this and von Mises and everything is to really gain an understanding of why people are truly attracted to totalitarianism. I think simply to just it's this combination of, as I said, von Mises, of this envy and resentment that is burning, combined with the desire in, or wholly separate from this desire to create, in their view, a more just society, or a quenching for power. George Orwell talked about in his book 1984 who constituted the members and the high officials of English socialism, or INGSOC, the ruling party, from the capitalist days before the INGSOC's revolution and takeover. It was the people who were burning for and desiring absolute power, even more than just merely the material privileges that they would have in this society. It's this sense that they want power, they want control
Yeah.
too, as well. And it's a difficult thing for many people to understand. You have to really do a deep dive. I don't even fully understand it because it's just alien to people like you and I. But I think that's where you have that people, and you describe, I think it was your uncle Theo, as a very cold man, as the recollections of your family
Oh
members.
yeah.
Many of these people were cold. Some of them were not, and they were very jovial people. I mean, Fidel Castro had a huge personality. And whatnot, but others also are cold, or they could hide it with a very jovial and convivial personality and hide those cold characteristics
Yeah.
too.
And we
So I think it's a combination of what Schlesinger, Meyer, in those quotes that I read, as well as von Mises. And I think that's what motivates a lot of these individuals who are intellectuals, who are very radical and very alienated. What are your thoughts about what I read, the German history and von Mises' good points that he's make? Do I make sense, or am I
well,
way
even
off
at
base?
especially at that time, like the 1920s and in the 1930s. I mean, this was an era when more and more people were getting into contact with just modern technology. Suddenly people started to have telephones. More people started to own radio sets, and even some people had television sets at some point. well, maybe not at that age, but it's like people were getting in touch with modern technology. More people had cars, so that change from this previous society in Germany where everybody was just a farmer, or you were worked in a factory maybe in a city. It created this impression that anything was possible, and this idea that if you have enough fanaticism and enough willpower. Hitler talked a lot about willpower. If you have that, then you can just take over anything. You just maybe take over the world. That was just the thinking at the time, because the utopian propaganda that worked pretty well, I think. And this is what we see today as well, when these movements, they start talking about the future they want to build, or the revenge they want to exert on their enemies. And I think at the time people thought a whole lot was possible, and they only saw the possibilities and they didn't look at the downsides. Now every time today somebody presents his ideological utopia and his idea, I always ask that person, or I ask the question in general: did that person analyze the problems of this idea or this plan? Did they have a risk assessment done, a proper risk assessment? Right, because if you go into an expedition, right, or you plan a company, you want to start a company and invest all your money in that company, or you want to just do any sort of project that is not fairly common, you do a risk assessment. What can go wrong? Am I missing something here? Do I have the right people? Am I too optimistic? What happens if that part fails? What happens if the other part fails? Usually what you find with these radical movements of all kinds is there is no risk assessment. They just say, this is the best shot we have. We don't have any other option. Anything else would lead to our doom. And then they start painting these rosy pictures. Well, the Putin will help us, or back in the day, we're gonna make a deal with the Russians, or the British believe in us. The British aristocracy totally loves us Nazis. They're gonna leave us alone. And we have so many friends in America. They love us. They would never get involved and stop us. So it's like this almost pathological optimism. It's this, people are talking to each other like this intoxication. It's like a drug binge or an alcohol binge, when people just lose every sense of reality, and it's all about the grand future they envision. Now, this is when the Nazis were plotting these gigantic buildings that would last thousands of years. They want to create a whole new
Yes.
city,
Germania.
and have kind of their mark on history for all eternity. It's intoxicating, and I think it was intoxicating when the Nazis began their rule, because of all the debt they were piling up to finance projects and to get the ball rolling. People just saw the positive effects, and the Nazis were fanatical about keeping the common prices for goods the same or normal. They
Yes.
did
Yes.
not want people to hear that this was based on a mountain of debt. People were not supposed to hear about the weaknesses of the Nazi economy, and there are books about the weaknesses of the Nazi economy, the gigantic flaws that were part of it. They wanted to make a car for everybody, right? They want to make a small underpowered car that many people could afford. It became the Volkswagen Beetle, but they had another name for it. They called it the Kraft durch Freude Wagen. This means the power through happiness car. That's actually what they called it. It's something. It's a name you would expect from North Korea, right? I mean, North Koreans would name things like that. But so they had this idea. It was going to cost like 1,000 or 2,000 Deutschmark. And they couldn't do it like this. They could not mass produce a car for a competitive price. They figured they would lose money for every car they sold. They still wanted to do it. So this was kind of the difference between America and the Nazi system. Now, in America, they were mass producing awesome cars and made a profit while doing so. And so the lowest paid guy at a Ford plant, he could afford a car. The lowest paid guy at Ford, he could have an apartment with several rooms and a real bathroom and a real kitchen, while the Germans, almost nobody had a good apartment. Almost nobody could afford a car. This is something that created this nasty competition among the Nazis, among themselves. You had to please the guys above you one way or the other in order to make it, in order to be privileged. And so
Yes.
why would they pick you and not these other 100 guys or these other 1,000 guys? Why should it be you? And it became this weird game of who knew this high-ranking Nazi from back in the old days. And like my ancestor, he was an early adopter. He joined the Nazi party very early. He went to prison for his activism multiple times. That's in the Bavarian files. But he proved his loyalty to the cause. That's why he became so successful. Not because he was the smartest, not because he had the most skills, but it was personal relationships. I mean, if in the early days you were dining with Hitler, if you had connections to Hitler's circle, which was a lot easier in the 20s than it was in the 30s, because in the 20s, I mean, when Hitler was a rising politician in Bavaria, it was fairly simple to get a spot at the table with his lunch gatherings. So there's like I think even
Yes.
so it was kind of easy. At least you knew somebody who had personally been in a room with Hitler. In Bavaria, that was not uncommon. You at least knew somebody who was in the room with Hitler. And so if that guy liked you, you had the best chances. If his gut feeling was positive, then you had a career. And we saw that how the higher ranking Nazis fought each other. They were backstabbing each other. There's possibilities of multiple assassinations and poisoning people and all this sort of stuff. And it was at some point, if you were in Hitler's close circle, you could seed an idea. You could start making jokes about somebody. And if Hitler caught on, he was laughing about those jokes, you could slowly but surely absolutely destroy somebody's career. Just by starting with jokes and then saying, "Oh well, this guy, he really messed up in that program, didn't he? And he's kind of stupid, isn't he? He's kind of laughable, right? Really." And if you did that for a long time, that guy would lose his career. So there was no healthy hierarchy. They didn't know how to make a healthy hierarchy. They had no idea about intelligence, especially foreign intelligence. The British were laughing their asses off when it came to German intelligence, and even the SS. They picked a guy as the head of SS intelligence, Reinhard Heydrich, who wasn't even a trained intelligence guy whatsoever. They thought he was, because he was a military communications guy, like with radio communications, and the official term for it sounded similar to the term for a trained intelligence officer. So somebody thought he was an intelligence officer, but Heydrich really wasn't one, and he got the job to lead the SS intelligence. It's that crazy, and I get back to that point of craziness where you can't distinguish anymore between normal and absolutely bonkers insanity. That's how
Yeah,
that's
I
how it played.
mean, yeah, yeah, and I think that's again all very good points, a very good description of the National Socialist dictatorship, and yes, quite a bit of the infighting. If you got, um, of course, if you were in Hitler's inner circle at various locations, like the Berchtesgaden, for example, I mean, you were basically in, and Nazi defectors and have talked about those types of meetings, notably, for example, Herman Roschnig, for example, in his books. I think that some of the best books, like Hitler Speaks and other Revolution of Nihilism, that really pierces the veil into understanding the Nazi dictatorship. Another book by Kurt Ludek, I forget the title. I think I knew Hitler, and he was another Nazi defector. Really good book. I recommend. Hitler's Table Talk. That's another good one that really gets into the mind of this. And the Nazi, we can, I mean, we could talk about this the rest of the morning into the afternoon, but I think that one of the most important lessons, and you mentioned Ford Motor, for example, I think one of the secret sauces of mid to the beginning of late 20th century America's economic success is two formulas: the combination of entrepreneurship and investment and private initiative. And you combine that dynamism by the correcting force of non communist labor union organizing and laws put into effect on state level at one time since the early days of this country against usury that capped usury rates, but later that was overturned by a more quote unquote conservative Supreme Court in 1978, and against laws against more predatory, non productive forms of finance, which later became loosened under Ronald Reagan and his successors, like leverage buyouts. Much of that was illegal because we learned from the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt and a portion of the New Deal, a portion of America's capitalist class and business elite. They were split on the New Deal, and one portion felt that our property and the very system that sustains this country and sustains their own livelihoods was under threat by either pro access organizations in the United States, which I argue are anti capitalist, and then also the communist movement and the socialist movement in the United States. We had to make a decision to keep that under control and to stabilize the system. So you had things like labor union organizing, at least initially, being made easier to correct the abuses, the real abuses that were going on with management, as well as laws and programs that were at times in existence in this country since our founding. And that helps stabilize the system. So you combine some very strict laws against self destructive behavior by elements of capitalism, and you combine that with the immeasurably superior system of private initiative and entrepreneurship and private investment, and you marry that together with an idea that has been known as demand side economics as opposed to supply side economics. I know a lot of conservatives, so-called conservatives, they like supply side economics, which is, to very crudely stated, is has a lot of mostly parallels libertarianism. Um, Demand side economics argues that if you give people the purchasing power, you give them living wages as long as a company is profitable. Workers can help share in that profits through higher wages, whether you have many good employers which exist or ones where labor unions in good faith bargain for higher wages and good benefits, then the workers are able to afford those apartments and everything. And what that did was it really stymied the anti capitalist appeal. And the communist parties in the United States really understood that. Theodore Adorno, who is a German neo-Marxist, actually said that really since the abuses of liberal or laissez-faire capitalism was how that was basically abolished through reforms that basically uh, then took away the appeal of economic Marxism. And of course, people like him then said, well, we have to have a newer approach to anti capitalism, of course. And the thing of it is that, excuse me, that's really the secret sauce. Demand side economics combined with uh, a rational economic nationalism, a very dynamic amount of entrepreneurship and private initiative and private property, which I think is a human right in many ways, or should be, and with, of course, certain limitations. And then you combine that with also a labor being more or less their bargaining power raised to a certain level and bargaining in good faith when needed and appropriate with the business classes. So that's my take. And Henry Ford understood at the time, whatever criticisms we may have about his business dealing with the Soviet Union and National Socialist Germany, he really was a visionary when it came to many within the business elite who realized even before the New Deal that you have to pay your workers a living wage. Why? Because then if you pay them wages that are above normal, then they're going to be able to afford the products that they're producing. And that's how I would argue that the rich get richer. You don't go through supply side economics that you just increase the supply and then everything will turn out okay. No, you have to give people the purchasing power to give them the consumer confidence. Now, unfortunately, in the United States, what happened was is that model faltered and was falsely blamed in the 1970s for the economic slowdown and the inflation. But really, what triggered the inflation was the Arab oil embargo, and that really put a shock to the system. And the advocates for the demand side economics really did not argue their case effectively, and they ceded ground to economists around a group called the Mont Pelerin Society. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Oh yeah.
And they were against all forms of economic statism, the bad ones, and Nazism and communism, but also labor unions, tariffs, and things of that nature, which institutionally were very anti communist. So what had happened was is that Milton Friedman and others, and Friedrich von Hayek, and there are things we all agree with them on, of course, but they gained advantages. Milton Friedman said that, we have to. He essentially said we got to prepare ourselves for a crisis. We have to have these ideas that we develop lying around. So once the time is opportune, then we can basically seize the moment and advance our agenda. And they were very well funded by elements of the
Yeah.
banking and industrial elites that didn't like any reforms of capitalism. They had that sort of Hans Hermann Hoppe type of view of aristocracy, if you will, from coming
Yeah.
from the
I
other
mean, there's
side.
like
And
this.
here
There's
we
like
are
this.
today.
It's as I said, it's really hard to build something. It's really hard to have any type of organization with 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, or 10,000 people, let alone a state or a functioning system with millions of people. It's really hard to accomplish, and so it's like even when you look at activist organizations, which are the easiest to form, right? Anybody can go on
Mhm.
social media and say, "I now have a group. I call it this. I call it that. Its ideological foundation is such and such." Anybody can start a group these days and start recruiting members. But what you see when people from the peasant class, when they start any kind of movement, any kind of group, not even something that is tied where everybody's tied together with contracts and with money, just any sort of loose organization, these people will start fighting with each other from the very first moment. It's really dysfunctional what you can see in activism when, I mean, we see this in right wing activism or extreme right wing activism all the time. These people hate each other and they will backstab each other all the
Mhm.
time. Even the so-called new right wing movements in America, there have been so many instances where people sort of secretly record each other saying things they shouldn't be saying, and then they blackmail each other with these recordings. By saying,
Mhm.
I got something on you, and if you don't want that released, you have to support me and my status in this group. No, I remember when there was so many examples of this, especially in the extreme right wing in Germany, because so many things that you say are illegal to say, or they will absolutely ruin your life. So when you have a secret recording, you can use it against somebody. And with the historical Nazis, they did that as well, because there were quite a few gay people in the Nazi movement, and they wanted to keep it quiet. They wanted to cultivate that possibility to live the way things are, but they wanted to keep it secret. Nobody was supposed to know about it in public, and that's when everybody started to collect dirt on everybody, and they were backstabbing each other and threatening each other with all this material, and this created this weird mafia style of secret alliances and secret plots and just all these plans that were hatched out, and these people are fighting each other. So it's like when people say let's bring it let's burn it all down, right? Let's burn it all to the ground and start over. I mean, do people understand how important or how difficult it is to actually build something? I mean, especially if radical activists of all kinds, they've never built anything. They've never built anything in their lives, especially not something that includes a number of other people. They never actually ever proven it that they can do it, right? So that's why when you see activist groups out there, you're usually looking for secret circles, established circles, running these activists, handing out the money, setting the agenda, and vetting people and picking certain people that they can control to run that activist organization. And what I always found, whether it's radical eco people, the radical greens, or anything, they usually have a terrible understanding of their own group and where the roots are, and the stuff they talk about when they make historical arguments. You can find it all over the place. It's like when climate activists, they don't know who built climate research. They don't know it was the military. They don't know that the Americans and the British ran it. And the NASA and NOAA, it's all kind of military, and the UK Met Office, it's all military. They built this thing, and then they put a computer on top of it in a simulation that says, and they say it can predict the future. But these activists don't know it. They think that by implementing this climate agenda, they can also bring down imperialism, they can bring down capitalism. But they understand neither who built climate science, nor do they understand capitalism, nor do they understand all the different empires that existed. And so it's like you let people run around, become part of an insurgency. Sometimes they don't even know it's an insurgency. Sometimes they kind of sort of know, but they're willing to make a pact with the devil, right? They're willing to
Yes.
burn it all down. They have all these weird ideas about limiting life or limiting human activity on the planet. And it's like this intoxicating drug-like rush they get by doing something for the activist cause. And so when you talk to these activist movements, like the Russians certainly are doing, the Russians, they even got their hand in some of this green activism, where they are against fracking. They talk bad about.
Yes.
They push this environmentalist movement, and sometimes these people don't even understand who is doing the pushing, right? It's like
Yeah.
you're talking. You have these people out there, and we supposedly have a democratic republic. It's kind of, there's a framework, and then there's, within that framework, you can change certain things by a majority vote. But at some point, if disinformation has been so powerful for so long, people don't know what they're talking about anymore, and so that's when you have established circles trying to maintain control, right? Because it's like how can you have freedom of speech in the United States? How can you have freedom of the press in the United States without the FBI checking on all these insurgency type movements, right? You can say things in America you could never say in Germany. If Kanye West goes
Very
on
true.
if Kanye West goes on the Alex Jones show and says he likes Hitler, he would be in legal trouble if he was a German citizen and said this on a German show.
Oh, I
So
know.
it's like
Europe
it's
has a
like
number of those
it's like
laws.
it's like
Yeah.
freedom of speech in America always came with a pretty strong FBI, sometimes with some very dirty tricks like the COINTELPRO stuff when they went after the
Yes.
Panthers and the Nazis and the KKK guys and some of the communists.
Correct.
It's like they were looking into these groups, sometimes bending the rules, sometimes breaking the rules, trying to find something. And I remember that fairly recently when Alex Jones was crying about the Sandy Hook verdicts against him, right? When he was saying that this was all a plot by the FBI and the CIA against him. Now, he
Hmm.
probably is probably just making it up as usual, but there may be people in the CIA who hate him. There may be people in the FBI who hate him, and there may be other networks that actually hate what this guy is doing. And the moment he breaks the law with these Sandy Hook reports, he's slandering parents of dead children as crisis actors, he's violating their rights. This is when some people, yeah, they may get involved and they try to finance these lawsuits against him. I mean, this is just what happens. So there's always somebody who's watching you, and if they find something, they can either destroy you or they can recruit you. And we've seen this with so many popular people in the media, even unpolitical people. I mean, in recent weeks and months, how many popular people on YouTube, millions of followers, video game streamers, millions of followers, how many of these guys got busted? There's now a scandal with the most popular guy on YouTube, Mr. Beast. It's a scandal with somebody in his office. That's all over the news.
Yes.
So this is like what happens. People get a certain amount of power, either with political content or entertainment content. They get a specific amount of power, and you start to see these abuses. You see these people saying, or these video game streamers telling, small scale female streamers, if you get in bed with me, I can help your career. Or they start talking to underage people, and it's like this the
Hmm.
moment they have a bit of power, they abuse it. But that doesn't mean people can't have power. There are people that are responsible enough. There are really good people out there. If they got money, if they got responsibility, if they got influence, they will use it the right way. But it's like, who do you
It's so
pick?
true.
Why did you give money to Alex Jones when this guy is a magnet for trouble? It's like
Yeah.
he's such a guy that he doesn't even realize the stuff he does. When he breaks a law or he's getting himself into hot water, he tends to think he's safe. He thinks he's smart. He covered his bases and nobody can harm him. And then he gets into trouble and then he's screaming, "This is all a big conspiracy against me. The mega conspiracy is after me because I'm so awesome." Right? It's like, be careful
Yeah,
what you share. Be
absolutely.
careful who you finance out there.
Yeah, there's a few things I wanted to wrap up, of course, before we stop, and we have so much more to talk about. Maybe next show we'll talk more about the Republican convention and J.D. Vance, which we did touch upon a little bit, but I know we focused on our paper and the motivations for embracing totalitarianism. Yeah, I think you're correct. I think number one, getting back to your point about risk taking and entrepreneurship and investment. I mean, we know from examples, people in my personal life, including my girlfriend, starting with her, members of my family, such as my father. You have a portion of money, whether it's loaned to you in a bank or you inherit or you save up, you put it for a business venture, and it often comes with risk. And that is backed up by business statistics all the time. And I think there needs to be a healthy respect, not only for private investment and entrepreneurs too, as well, but I think also that needs to be also taught to people in the high school as a mandatory national curriculum. I think there needs to be a component added with basic economics, real world economics, not really just theoretical economics, either from the neoliberal right or Marxist or socialist pie in the sky economics. I think there needs to be an understanding of the role of labor and why it's important, and why they should be well compensated as long as they're competent. And if they're not competent, why they're a liability for the company. I'm not the type of social reformer who believes that people should be kept on the job no matter what. I think if you break something intentionally, you go on strike or damage or subvert a company, or you're just totally incompetent, I think the employer has every right to fire you, and potentially, if it's willful damage to property, to pursue legal damages or law enforcement against the individual. On the other hand, there needs to be also in this education program that I propose, there needs to be an understanding of the role, not only of the importance of well compensated labor, but also an understanding of the role of the investor and the entrepreneur too, as why it's important that other than curbing certain excesses, they need to be nurtured and appreciated as long as they're producing a good product or a valuable product or service and whatnot. And they need to be celebrated in that respect. And that's where I do have certain libertarian tendencies that they still do hold over in little bits and pieces from when I was a lot younger and much more of a typical Reagan conservative. Um, so I think that needs to, one way I think, to really educate people and really have an understand where people, the average voter and the average citizen, can have an understanding of an economics from how it actually functions in the real world, and why each component, labor, investor, entrepreneur, owner, as well as consumer, why all those factors are important, why at times government needs to play a role in order to prevent excesses from, through, you know, excesses in free enterprise or capitalism when left totally unmoored, or, for example, an understanding of how foreign trade works, like dumping by totalitarian planned economies, and how they'll just dump products in the market, and how that undercuts businesses, which hurts communities and hurts investors who want to invest in bread and butter products and services too. So I think there needs to be an understanding of a better understanding of economics by the voters, and I don't blame the voters for that. Really, what I think the public education system on a national level needs to inculcate that as part of patriotic education, which I support on a national level. And I know the people that believe in quote unquote 10th Amendment states' rights issues and whatnot, strict federalists, small f, federalists will get very upset when I say that. But again, we have to look at the problems as they exist in reality and not pie in the sky stuff. We're not the same country as we were in 1789 and into the 1790s, when we had the Articles of Confederation and then, of course, the great compromise of our Constitution. Um, and then my last point before we go and wrap up, of course, is because I have another interview I have to attend to. I'm interviewing a Senate candidate in the Republican primary down here in Florida, and I just have to take a little bit of a break. But one of the other points I think you brought up, Alex, that's excellent and is very important, is how environmentalism, and look, I'm an environmentalist to a point, but to a large degree, but there is also there are cynical forces that do exploit environmental issues like climate change for their own advancement. We know that the Russians have funded, through cutouts, anti-fracking groups, for example. We know that, and they use that as a geopolitical strategy, while countries like Russia and China still have huge environmental problems in their pursuit of super industrialization at all costs. I remember, and this is the last point I'll make on this documentary called The Seductive Illusion. It came out, it was published by Accuracy Media. It came out in 1989. I have an old VHS copy of it. Unfortunately, it's not available on DVD. And it's not available on YouTube. It's called The Seductive Illusion. You could probably interlibrary loan it here in the United States to our American viewers. And J. Michael Waller, who is a well-known national security analyst, and he's widely known here in our circles. And J. Michael Waller used to be an environmental leftist, and he got very active in the campaign against building the Seabrook nuclear power plant in one of the New England states. I forget which one. And when he got involved with them, he was very concerned about the potential environmental impacts of the Seabrook nuclear power plant. And he spoke with one of the leaders of the campaign to basically not have that nuclear plant built. And what that person said to J. Michael Waller is like, the environment, that's the least of our concern. What we want to do is cripple imperialism's industrial capability. Don't you see? Don't you understand? So that launched him in a rabbit hole, as well as other life experiences into the 1980s, of why he became very much a hardcore person who has really exposed the machinations of communist fronts even to this day. So I close with that point is that, everyone will use uh, pressure points, pincers, to attack free societies. And they use the vulnerabilities in every political current, social class, uh, religious affiliation, gender, race. And that's where the totalitarian bloc will use that. Not because they want to advance rights and legitimate aspirations, but they use it as a Trojan horse to undermine free societies. And Alex, myself, Jeff Nyquist, Trevor Loudon, J. Michael Waller, and many others have all publicized this information. And we'll continue to do so. Alex, I could go on and on talking about this. Thank you so much for joining the program. Where can people find your work, Alex?
The website is candorintel.com, and that's where you can also find the link to the YouTube channel. It's also called Candor Intelligence Network. You can find my books on Amazon. And we're also on Patreon, so you can donate on Patreon and get some other stuff on Patreon, like my documentary on the actual and partially secret history of climate science. It's like a 90-minute documentary where I explain who really built it and then what certain people did with it. So there's a lot of books from me on Amazon on various aspects on all of this, so people can find that fairly easily.
And on my end, I just dropped a few weeks ago a new Substack newsletter / research paper page called Wilderness of Mirrors, similar to our show that Alex and I have. And I dropped a whole bunch of essays and papers on a variety of topics, one of which we discussed for a portion of this interview, the ultimate domino, Red Dawn 2.0. It's kind of where I left off in my book that I published years ago called Red Dawn in Retrospect. Now this is an updated version of that. So feel free to subscribe. It is free access for the papers. I kind of changed that around because at least I want people to get used to my writings and for people to have the information ready so they can disseminate to other people, so we can raise awareness from other Americans, from other people in Europe, on really the true nature of the threats to our respective free societies. Thank you, Alex, again for joining us. It's as usual. It's been a great show. I learned a lot from you. You have a lot of very incisive opinions, and I really appreciate you.
All right, thanks. It's an awesome show, and looking forward to the next one.